Imagine walking through a bustling medieval marketplace. You see merchants shouting, the smell of roasting meat in the air, and then you spot it. A tiny, brown, round object that looks like something you'd throw away today. But back then, this little thing was worth its weight in gold. Yep, I'm talking about coconut shells. Sounds crazy, right? A coconut shell worth a fortune? Stick with me, because this is one of those, wait, people actually did that stories? First off, let's set the scene. Medieval Europe wasn't exactly a tropical paradise. There were no beaches lined with coconut palms in, say, France, Germany, or England. If you wanted a coconut, it had to come from faraway lands, tropical regions that were reachable only by dangerous sea voyages or long overland treks. So basically, coconuts were super rare. Picture a world without Amazon or supermarkets. If you wanted something exotic, it wasn't just a matter of buying it online. It meant your merchant risked storms, pirates, and bandits just to get it to you. Now, why were people so obsessed with a coconut shell? Well, first, rarity always drives value. Think about it. If everyone had one, it would just be a boring brown nut. But because only a select few could get their hands on it, coconuts were considered a luxury item. Not just any luxury, though. They were exotic luxury, the kind of thing nobles would show off at banquets. Owning a coconut shell was like having a designer handbag today. People literally displayed them on tables, sometimes carved into cups or small bowls, and everyone around would admire it. It was like saying, "Look at me, I've got connections all the way across the oceans. I'm rich, fancy, and worldly." And here's the fun part. They weren't just for show. These coconut shells had practical uses too. Medieval cooks and household staff discovered that the hard shells made sturdy bowls and ladles. Some were even used as fuel for fires, especially in areas where wood was scarce. Imagine tossing a coconut shell into your fireplace. It burned hot, gave off a nice aroma, and kept your soup warm. And some artisans loved carving them into ornaments or jewelry. So it wasn't just a status symbol. It had utility. People were basically turning this exotic nut into everything from practical kitchenware to decorative art. Pretty smart, huh? There are some hilarious stories around coconut shells, too. Sailors risked life and limb to bring coconuts to Europe. Some tales tell of noble families treasuring a coconut cup almost like it was a crown jewel. Can you imagine sitting at a medieval feast, sipping your mead from a tiny brown shell while everyone else is jealous because their cups are just ordinary wood or pewter? That was the level of status we're talking about. And if a coconut accidentally cracked or got damaged, it could have been considered a tragedy. People literally valued these shells like treasure. But as with most things, the fame did not last forever. As trade routes improved and shipping became more reliable, coconuts started arriving more frequently. Suddenly, what was once exotic and rare became commonplace. You could buy a coconut for a fraction of what it used to cost. The once coveted coconut shell lost its luster. Imagine going from, "Wow, that's priceless," to, "Meh, we have those in the kitchen drawer." The very thing that people once displayed with pride became, well, something you might just toss in the compost heap. Fast forward to today, and most of us don't even think twice about coconut shells. After enjoying the coconut water or flesh, we often throw the shell away, compost it, or maybe use it as a plant pot if we're feeling crafty. Some artisans and eco-friendly enthusiasts still carve them into bowls, cups, or jewelry, but for the most part, they're considered trash. The same object that once represented wealth, status, and a daring global trade journey is now literally waste. Funny, right? So here's a little thought for you. Next time you sip coconut water or toss a shell in the compost, remember that once in medieval Europe, people would have killed, or at least bargained fiercely, for that exact same shell. It's almost like looking at a designer item today and realizing one day it might just be something everyone casually throws away. Makes you think about what we value, doesn't it? Now, I have to ask, would you have paid a fortune just to drink from a coconut shell? Or maybe display it like a crown jewel on your table? Honestly, thinking about it, it's kind of hilarious. That tiny brown shell had people talking, trading, traveling, and showing off like it was the ultimate treasure. And today, well, we barely even glance at it before tossing it aside. So, yeah. Coconut shells. Once exotic, once priceless, once the symbol of wealth and daring absolute treasure. And now, compost material. It's kind of poetic when you think about it. A little reminder that value isn't always in the object itself, but in how rare or risky or admired it is. And sometimes, things we casually throw away today could be tomorrow's treasures. Or yesterday's gold. Crazy to imagine, right? The next time you see a coconut shell lying around, just think. People once treated this little thing like it was pure gold. And maybe, just maybe, you'll give it a second glance before tossing it in the trash. Ambergris. Okay, brace yourself for this one because it's going to sound absolutely disgusting at first. But stick with me because people literally went crazy over it. I'm talking about ambergris. Yeah, that's right. The stuff that comes from whale vomit. You heard me correctly, whale vomit. And somehow humans took this, well, let's call it ocean barf, and turned it into one of the most prized, luxurious substances in the world. So, picture this. Medieval and early modern Europe. Fancy nobles, perfumed ballrooms, silk dresses, and people obsessed with smelling good. Not just okay smelling, mind you. We're talking about perfumes so potent and expensive that they were status symbols, signals of wealth and taste. And in the center of it all was ambergris, this mysterious, grayish-brown, waxy substance. Nobody really knew what it was at first. Some thought it washed up from the sea as a gift from mermaids. Others had wild theories about its origins. And then, eventually, someone figured out, yes, it comes from the intestines of sperm whales. And yes, it's literally partially digested whale matter that sometimes gets expelled, either vomited or passed as feces, and floats for years in the ocean before washing ashore. Gross? Absolutely. Valuable? You bet. But why did people love it so much? Well, for starters, ambergris has an incredible fragrance fixative property. That means when mixed with perfumes, it makes the scent last forever. Perfumes back then didn't last like modern sprays. They'd fade within hours. But add a bit of ambergris, and suddenly your scent could linger for days. If you were a noble attending court or a fancy ball, this was a serious deal. Smelling amazing wasn't just about vanity, it was social currency. And because ambergris was so rare, you couldn't exactly farm it or mine it. Its value skyrocketed. People would pay fortunes for even tiny chunks. Sailors returning with a lump of ambergris were practically guaranteed fame and fortune. And that's where the stories get wild. Ambergris was literally hunted like treasure, but not in the traditional sense. You didn't go chasing whales to get it most of the time. Instead, you scoured beaches, especially in places where sperm whales were common, like the coasts of Africa, the Caribbean, or the Maldives. If a chunk washed ashore, people were ready to fight, negotiate, and sometimes even commit crimes to claim it. There are records of towns literally trying to regulate ambergris collection because the demand was so insane. It was that valuable. Some wealthy individuals even had secret contacts and networks to track where ambergris might wash up. It sounds ridiculous, but imagine the logistics of being a medieval whale vomit entrepreneur. And the uses weren't limited to perfume. Some cultures believed ambergris had magical or medicinal properties. It was thought to cure headaches, act as an aphrodisiac, and even help with stomach ailments. Nobles would sometimes ingest tiny amounts dissolved in alcohol or oils, something you'd never try today. It was like the ultimate luxury, part perfume, part medicine, part exotic collectible. And again, because it was so rare, owning ambergris was like saying, I have power, wealth, and connections to the mysterious oceans of the world. But, as with most things, times changed. The age of global trade, chemical research, and synthetic fragrances eventually made ambergris less critical. Perfume makers could now use substitutes or synthetics that mimicked the scent fixative property. Plus, spotting whale vomit on beaches wasn't always guaranteed, and with modern environmental laws protecting whales, it became mostly illegal to harvest. Suddenly, ambergris went from must-have luxury item to something that, while still interesting and sometimes used, is mostly a curiosity. People don't fight over it or trade it like gold anymore. In fact, most of it gets discarded or sits in specialized collections, occasionally fetching a high price only in niche markets. What's really fascinating and a little funny is that something humans once treated like absolute gold now makes us recoil a bit. Think about it. People paid fortunes to rub whale vomit on themselves or their perfume bottles to smell amazing. While today, we're grossed out by the same substance. It's one of those perfect examples of how value is completely relative and shaped by rarity, utility, and culture. Something disgusting to one person can be treasure to another, and vice versa. So, here's a question for you. Would you have hunted beaches, bargained with sailors, or paid an insane amount just for a chunk of whale vomit? It sounds absurd, but in medieval and early modern Europe, that was reality. Ambergris wasn't just a perfume ingredient, it was a symbol of wealth, mystery, and the human obsession with luxury. The fact that it's now rare and mostly ignored adds a little irony to the story. Something once prized above almost anything can become almost meaningless once society changes. And if you want a modern twist, ambergris still exists in some perfumery circles, but it's mostly niche, super expensive, and surrounded by legal restrictions. A few luxury perfumers might use tiny amounts, but it's no longer the global treasure it once was. Meanwhile, the rest of us just know it as that weird thing that comes from a whale's digestive system. Quite the fall from glory, huh? So, next time you're enjoying a fancy perfume, or even just smelling something that lingers on your clothes, think about ambergris. Once upon a time, this gross, mysterious whale byproduct had people obsessing, trading, and even risking their lives. And now, most of it is tossed aside, forgotten, or tucked away in private collections. It's a little reminder that value is not about the object itself. It's about the story, the rarity, and the human imagination. Crazy, right? A little glob of whale vomit could make someone richer than a king, and today it's basically considered trash. The next time you think something is worthless, maybe it's just waiting for the right culture, the right context, or the right person to see it as treasure. ashes from burned plants. All right, let's talk about something that sounds super boring at first, but is actually one of the weirdest treasures in human history. Ashes from burned plants. Yep, I'm serious. I'm talking about potash. You might be thinking, wait, ashes? People paid for ashes? And the answer is a loud, enthusiastic yes. People literally built industries around this stuff, and it was once considered extremely valuable. Today, we barely glance at it, but back then, it was a game changer. So, first off, what is potash? Basically, it's the ashes left after burning wood, plants, or even seaweed in large quantities. People would carefully collect these ashes, leach them in water to extract the soluble salts, and then evaporate the solution to get the final product, potash. Sounds simple, right? But here's the catch. It wasn't simple at all. To get enough potash to be useful, you needed tons of plant material, which meant cutting forests, drying wood, or gathering massive piles of plants. It was labor-intensive, and because of that, it was considered valuable. Now, why did people care so much about potash? Well, this stuff was critical for a bunch of industries that shaped life in medieval and early modern Europe. For starters, glassmaking. Back then, making clear, stable glass was a big challenge. Potash acted as a flux, lowering the melting point of sand and helping create smooth, workable glass. Without it, glassmakers would have been stuck with lumpy, fragile, or cloudy glass. Imagine trying to make windows, bottles, or fancy goblets without this magical ingredient. You'd basically be stuck with crude rocks. Potash was also a key ingredient in soap production. Yes, soap. Before the chemical factories of the 19th and 20th centuries, soap was made by mixing animal fat with potash. The chemical reaction between the two creates that slippery, soapy goodness we take for granted today. So, in a world without modern chemistry, potash was literally the backbone of hygiene and cleanliness. Nobles, townspeople, and artisans all depended on it. A shortage of potash could mean lousy soap, poor glass, and even economic problems in regions that relied on trade. It was basically a high-tech resource for its time. And here's where it gets interesting. There are some quirky historical stories about potash. In some areas, entire forests were cleared just to make enough ashes for glassmakers or soap makers. Imagine your local town council announcing, "Everyone, chop down the trees and burn them. We need potash." People literally turned entire natural resources into wealth. In North America, for example, potash became one of the first major exports in the colonial period. Farmers would burn wood and sell the ashes overseas. They were essentially turning trees into cash. Some regions even had potash booms, similar to gold rushes. There were specialized potash workers, trade routes, and merchants who competed fiercely to supply the European markets. You could make a fortune if you had access to good wood, labor, and transportation. And because it was so in demand, there were even attempts to control pricing and production, just like with modern commodities. So next time you think chemicals are boring, remember, ashes once ruled economies. But as with many once valuable things, time changed everything. With the Industrial Revolution and the rise of chemical engineering, people discovered synthetic alternatives. Instead of burning tons of wood or plants to extract potash, chemists could produce it in factories, cheaply and in massive quantities. The value of natural potash plummeted, and suddenly all those laborious ash-collecting efforts were mostly obsolete. What was once a high-demand, valuable substance became almost worthless. It was a classic case of technology making a previously expensive, labor-intensive product cheap and accessible. Think about the irony. For centuries, people went through enormous effort just to get these ashes, which were then shipped, traded, and prized for their industrial uses. And now, potash is basically just a chemical you can buy off the shelf, and the idea of burning trees to make soap seems absurd. It's funny to imagine someone centuries ago looking at a modern chemical factory and thinking they just make it from a vat? Where's the glory in that? But even today, potash isn't entirely forgotten. It's still used in agriculture as a fertilizer, and some specialty soap or glass products still rely on natural potash. However, the mystical aura it once had, the labor, the rarity, the danger of transporting massive amounts of ashes across trade routes is completely gone. Modern society has taken a once exotic, valuable substance and turned it into something mundane. And here's a fun little perspective for you. Imagine being a farmer in colonial America, chopping wood, building massive bonfires, collecting ashes, and shipping them across the ocean, only to hear a few centuries later that people can make the same thing in a laboratory in a day. The mind-blowing part is how much effort and value were tied to something we now treat as trash, literally burned up leaves and sticks. Who would have thought that ashes could make or break fortunes? So, next time you see a pile of ashes from your fireplace, think about it. Somewhere in history, those ashes could have been turning entire economies, funding trade networks, and keeping glassmakers and soap makers in business. Today, they're just ashes. But the story behind them, that's what made them priceless, fascinating, and yes, even a little magical. It's one of those reminders that value isn't always about how useful or fancy something is. It's about context, rarity, and what people need at a particular time. Back then, potash was gold. Now, it's garbage. Crazy how time changes everything, right? Animal bones. All right, this one might make you think twice next time you see a discarded chicken wing or rib. We're talking about animal bones. Yes, the very same bones you probably toss in the trash or compost. But back in early Europe, these weren't just leftovers. They were extremely valuable resources that people depended on for a surprising variety of uses. And honestly, some of these uses are pretty creative. Even a little gross by today's standards. So first off, why were bones valuable? Well, in medieval and early modern Europe, people were resourceful, out of necessity. Nothing went to waste because everything had a use. Bones were tough, durable, and easy to shape, which made them perfect for all sorts of tools, household items, and even art. And because the supply of bones wasn't infinite, especially for large animals, people treated them as prized materials. Imagine being a craftsman in a small town. You could make buttons, combs, needles, or even dice out of bones. Those small items might seem mundane now, but back then they were essential for everyday life. Buttons weren't mass-produced in factories. They were hand-carved, often from bone. And the people who made them, they were skilled artisans whose work was highly valued. But buttons were just the tip of the iceberg. Bones were also used to make tools. Carpenters, leather workers, and even farmers used bones for various implements. Sharp bones could be turned into awls for piercing leather, or shaped into hooks, needles, and small knives. And for people who couldn't afford metal tools, bone was sometimes the only option. Even decorative items like combs or carved figurines were often made from bone. Some bones were polished, etched, or painted, turning them into tiny pieces of art that could be passed down through generations. So in a very real sense, bones were not just trash. They were the building blocks of both functional life and aesthetic expression. And the uses didn't stop there. Bones were also highly valuable as fertilizer. People discovered that crushing animal bones into powder created a nutrient-rich substance that helped crops grow. Think about that. Bones that were once part of a meal could later help feed the next harvest. Farmers would collect bones from slaughterhouses, leftover meals, or even hunt sites, crush them into small pieces or powder, and scatter them over their fields. This practice was so common that some regions actually had bone collection as a small industry, with people trading bones specifically for agricultural use. It was an early example of recycling in action, a way to turn what would otherwise be waste into wealth. And of course, there are some fascinating stories about how bones were treated like treasure. In some European towns, bones from large animals, especially cows and horses, were carefully stored and traded. People would even barter with bones, exchange them for other goods or services. And certain bones, like ivory from elephants imported through trade, or large animal leg bones, were especially prized for carving and ornamentation. Some bones became decorative items in churches or noble households, intricately carved with religious or symbolic designs. So, in a way, bones were a currency of creativity, a versatile material that could be both practical and luxurious, depending on how it was used. Now, here's the funny part. Despite all this value, bones eventually lost their status. Why? Well, industrialization changed everything. Factories could produce buttons, tools, and fertilizers more efficiently and cheaply than hand-carved bone items. Metal tools became widely available, and chemical fertilizers replaced crushed bones as the preferred agricultural boost. The demand for bones dropped sharply. What was once a critical resource became something most people discarded without a second thought. Today, we barely noticed them, except maybe in a compost pile or at a butcher shop where they're thrown away. It's kind of wild to think about. Bones, which once played a central role in daily life, in art, in agriculture, and even in commerce, are now mostly just trash or compost material. And yet they shaped centuries of human activity. They were essential for survival, for work, and for beauty. Entire economies, even if small, were built on collecting, carving, and trading bones. Without bones, life in early Europe would have been a lot harder, less creative, and less resourceful. And here's a little perspective for you. Imagine being a craftsman back then. You're taking a leftover rib or leg bone and carefully turning it into a button for a noble's coat. That button will last for years, maybe get handed down, and represents not just your skill, but also the ingenuity of turning something waste into something essential. Fast forward to today, and most of us wouldn't even think twice before tossing those bones in the trash. It's a dramatic shift in perception. What was once treasure is now just leftover scraps. Even today, bones are still used in some niche ways. Artists, sculptors, and craftsmen sometimes carve them for decorative pieces. Organic farmers still use crushed bones as fertilizer. And scientists use bones in archaeology and anthropology to learn about past civilizations. But the everyday, practical, essential value that bones once had, that's gone. What's left is a story that makes you realize just how inventive humans have always been when it comes to using the materials at hand. So, next time you look at a pile of bones, whether it's from a meal or a butcher shop, remember that these humble leftovers once held real power, real value, and real importance. They were tools, art, and fertilizer, sometimes all at once. And maybe, just maybe, you'll pause before tossing them away, thinking about how this trash once helped sustain life, craft culture, and drive early economies. Crazy, right? Something most of us consider worthless today was once the most versatile and prized material in Europe. Animal bones, from the trash heap to treasures of survival, creativity, and commerce. It's a story that really makes you appreciate how differently people in the past saw the world. And honestly, it makes you wonder what we're tossing today that might be tomorrow's treasure.
Sawdust. All right, get ready, because this next one might make you look at your woodworking scraps in a completely new way. We're talking about sawdust. Yep, that fine little powder that falls off every time someone cuts wood. Today, most of us just sweep it up and throw it away or use it in the compost. But back in the day, sawdust was considered incredibly valuable. Seriously, people found all sorts of uses for it, and it played a surprisingly big role in everyday life. Let's start with the basics. Imagine you're in a medieval or early modern town. Wood is everywhere. It's the main building material, the fuel for cooking, heating, and even blacksmithing. When carpenters worked on furniture, doors, or tools, tiny bits of wood would fall everywhere. Now, most people might think, that's just waste. But clever artisans and households quickly realized that this byproduct had incredible utility. Sawdust wasn't just trash, it was a raw material waiting to be transformed. One of the first and most common uses was as stuffing for furniture. Remember those big overstuffed chairs, couches, and mattresses from centuries past? They didn't have memory foam or synthetic padding. Instead, craftsmen would stuff them with sawdust. It provided firmness, comfort, and insulation. And because wood was readily available, it was cheap enough to use in large quantities. Some mattresses even combined sawdust with horsehair or straw to create the perfect mix of softness and support. So every time a carpenter made a table or chair, the leftover sawdust was recycled into comfort for homes, basically turning scraps into cozy furniture. Sawdust also had a surprising role as insulation. Houses in medieval Europe weren't exactly known for keeping warm. Walls were often thin, windows small, and drafts everywhere. People figured out that packing sawdust into gaps, floors, or under roofs helped trap heat. It was an early, low-cost form of insulation that made a big difference in cold winters. Imagine being able to survive the freezing nights with nothing but a sawdust-filled floorboard keeping you cozy. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. And because woodworkers produced tons of sawdust, it was an abundant, reusable resource. And if you think that's clever, wait until you hear this. Sawdust was also a cheap and efficient fuel. Before coal and modern heating, many people burned wood to stay warm, but wood could be expensive or hard to transport. Sawdust could be compressed into small cakes or logs and used for fires. It burned hot, relatively cleanly, and could even be mixed with other organic materials like straw to extend its burning time. In some regions, sawdust became such a critical fuel source that people would collect it from workshops and factories just to keep their homes heated through the winter. So what we casually sweep away today was literally keeping people alive back then. And here's where the stories get a little quirky. Some medieval markets even had sawdust sellers. Yes, actual merchants whose job was to collect, package, and sell sawdust for furniture stuffing, insulation, and fuel. Wealthy households might pay extra to get fine, dry sawdust that would work perfectly for padding chairs or keeping a house warm. Even sailors carried sawdust on long voyages as a lightweight fuel or bedding material. It sounds crazy now, but it made perfect sense back then. Sawdust was versatile, abundant, and most importantly, useful. Of course, over time, things changed. With the Industrial Revolution, new materials like cotton, horsehair, and synthetic padding replaced sawdust in furniture. Coal and manufactured fuels replaced it for heating. Modern insulation materials, fiberglass, foam, and so on made sawdust insulation obsolete. Suddenly, what was once highly practical and valuable became something you just sweep into the trash. And because sawdust is messy, dusty, and not particularly glamorous, it got a reputation as actual waste. People stopped seeing it as treasure, and today we mostly ignore it unless we're doing gardening, woodworking, or composting. But even in modern times, sawdust hasn't disappeared completely. Some craftsmen still use it for traditional furniture making, some farmers use it as bedding for animals, and woodworkers often mix it with glue or resin to repair or shape things. Eco-conscious people even use sawdust for absorbing spills or creating biomass fuel. So while it's no longer gold, it still finds ways to be useful. The difference is, back then, sawdust was essential, and now it's mostly an optional convenience. Here's a funny perspective. Imagine walking through a medieval workshop. There's sawdust everywhere, floating in the air like a fine mist. People are working on chairs, packing mattresses, filling cracks in houses, and heating their stoves with the same stuff. Today, we might just sneeze and grab a broom, but back then, every speck of sawdust was potentially money, comfort, or warmth. It was a little powder with a lot of power. So the next time you sweep your workshop, garage, or kitchen floor, take a moment to appreciate the humble sawdust. It's a reminder of human ingenuity, how people turn what we now consider trash into essential tools for comfort, warmth, and survival. Sawdust shows us that value isn't always obvious. Something tiny, dusty, and messy can actually make life better, safer, and more comfortable if you know how to use it. Crazy to think, right? A pile of tiny wood particles was once worth collecting, trading, and using strategically. It was practical, versatile, and even essential in some places. Today, we might just vacuum it up, but in the past, sawdust was one of the unsung heroes of everyday life, quietly making homes more comfortable, keeping people warm, and helping artisans craft furniture that would last generations. So the next time you glance at a pile of sawdust, remember this messy byproduct was once a treasure trove of practical uses, the medieval version of a multi-tool, mattress, heater, and more all in one. Who knew that the stuff you sleep away today could have been essential for survival and comfort centuries ago?
Seaweed, kelp. All right, prepare to have your mind blown by something you probably just think of as slimy beach stuff. Seaweed, specifically kelp. Yep, that squishy green-brown ocean plant that washes up on shores and sometimes gets stuck in your shoes. Today, most of us barely pay attention to it. Maybe it ends up in fertilizer, sushi, or a compost pile. But back in the 19th century, kelp was basically gold from the sea. People literally harvested it obsessively because it was incredibly valuable. For one reason, iodine. So let's set the scene. We're in the 1800s. Medical science is starting to advance. People are learning about minerals and nutrients, and doctors are discovering how critical iodine is for human health. Iodine deficiency can lead to goiters and other health issues, which were surprisingly common in parts of Europe. Now, where do you get iodine in large quantities? From kelp. The big, thick seaweed growing along coasts, especially in places like Scotland, Ireland, and parts of Scandinavia, was packed with this essential element. Suddenly, that slimy stuff people had ignored for centuries became a critical resource for public health and industry. And that's when the kelp phrase took off. People started harvesting kelp on an industrial scale. Entire coastal communities depended on it. Men and women would wade into the cold waters, cut the kelp with knives or sickles, and drag it to shore. Then it would be dried, burned, and processed to extract iodine. It sounds simple, but it was incredibly hard work. Imagine spending hours in freezing water, wet and cold, just to collect a slippery, slimy plant that today most of us just step over without a second thought. But for them, this was serious business and very profitable. Kelp wasn't just valuable for iodine, though. Before the mineral was fully understood, people were already burning it for potash. Yes, that's right. The same plant ashes used in glass-making and soap production centuries earlier were partly sourced from seaweed. So kelp had dual value, one for chemical industries and later, specifically for iodine extraction. In some areas, the revenue from kelp harvests transformed entire communities. Kelp cutters could make more money in a season than traditional farmers or fishermen, which created a unique coastal economy. And here's a fun historical tidbit. There were even conflicts over kelp rights. Coastal landowners realized how profitable it could be, so access to the best kelp beds became highly regulated or sometimes fiercely contested. You can imagine local disputes erupting over who had the right to wade into the water and harvest the biggest, thickest plants. In some cases, kelp harvesters became semi-celebrities in their communities because of the money and importance tied to their work. People didn't just collect kelp casually. They treated it like a precious, almost magical resource. But as with many things, technology eventually changed the game. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, synthetic iodine production became possible. Chemists figured out how to make iodine from cheap mineral sources, which meant kelp was no longer essential. Coastal harvests dropped dramatically, and those communities that had relied on kelp for decades suddenly had to adapt or face economic hardship. What was once a lifeline for trade and medicine became largely irrelevant. The same slimy plant that once fueled industries, kept communities wealthy, and helped prevent goiter became something people mostly ignored or even considered a nuisance when it washed up on the beach. It's funny to think about, right? A plant that people once risked frostbite, cuts, and exhaustion to harvest now often just ends up in compost bins, fertilizer, or sushi. The context completely changes the value. Back then, it was a lifeline. Today, we barely notice it. It's a perfect example of how something can go from treasure to trash simply because technology and society evolve. And even today, kelp isn't completely worthless. People harvest it for food, fertilizers, cosmetics, and even biofuel experiments. But the frenzy and obsession of the 19th century? Gone. The days when communities built their economies around dragging slimy seaweed out of the icy waters are long past. Most of us casually walked past kelp-covered beaches without realizing its historic importance. So, next time you're walking along the shore and see kelp piled up, imagine the scene 2 centuries ago. Hundreds of workers in wet clothes chopping, hauling, drying, and burning this very same seaweed, all because it was literally saving lives through its iodine content. They treated it like gold, and now we treat it mostly like trash, or at best a garnish on sushi. It's a perfect reminder that value isn't inherent in an object or substance. It's about context, utility, and demand. What was once essential for health, industry, and community survival can become almost meaningless if society finds a better, easier way to get the same results. Kelp went from life-saving treasure to beach nuisance, all within a few decades. Crazy, right? Slimy, smelly seaweed, once obsessively harvested, now mostly ignored. And yet, it literally changed lives, economies, and health standards in the 19th century. That's the power of perspective and history. Sometimes the things we consider trash today were once priceless treasures. So, next time you step over a patch of kelp, remember, centuries ago, people literally risked life and limb to get that slimy stuff out of the ocean. It was valuable, vital, and worth a fortune. And now, most of us don't even glance at it. History has a funny way of flipping value upside down.
Feathers. Goose, swan. All right. Get ready to think about something that's probably sitting in your closet right now, or at least something very similar. Feathers. Specifically, goose and swan feathers. Yep. Those fluffy, soft things that make pillows, comforters, and jackets so cozy.
Today, most of us barely consider them. They're just stuffing for bedding or jackets or replaced entirely by synthetic materials. But back in the day, feathers were a true symbol of luxury, worth their weight in gold to the right people. So let's go back a few centuries. Imagine you're a noble or a wealthy merchant in Europe. You live in a drafty stone house, winter is harsh, and comfort is rare. Beds are basic, blankets are heavy and scratchy, and sleeping was often, well, uncomfortable. But then there's feathers. Soft, warm, resilient feathers, especially from geese or swans, were game changers. A mattress, pillow, or comforter stuffed with these feathers wasn't just a place to sleep, it was a luxury experience. Almost like sleeping on a cloud. People didn't just want them for warmth, they wanted the prestige. Owning feather-stuffed bedding said, "I'm rich, I'm comfortable, and I know how to live well." Now, why geese and swans specifically? Well, their feathers are larger, stronger, and more insulating than most other birds. Geese feathers, for instance, were the perfect combination of fluff and durability. Swan feathers were even rarer and softer, making them a symbol of extreme luxury. These weren't cheap materials you could pick up at the market. Harvesting them required time, care, and access to the birds themselves. And because these birds weren't always plentiful and swans were often protected by royal decree, the feathers were naturally exclusive. And here's where it gets interesting. The collection process. Unlike today's mass production, back then the people had to pluck feathers by hand, often from live birds or after the birds were carefully slaughtered. Geese farmers sometimes raised birds specifically for their feathers, timing the harvests carefully so the bird's plumage was at its peak. Swan feathers were often sourced from wild populations, making them even rarer. In some regions, possessing swan feathers without permission could get you in serious legal trouble because swans were considered royal property. You're literally handling royal treasure in soft, fluffy form. Feathers weren't just used for sleeping comfort either. They became a status symbol in fashion. Wealthy men and women adorned hats, cloaks, and ceremonial outfits with plumes of goose or swan feathers. They were also used for quills in writing. Yes, those elegant, iconic writing tools of the past were often made from large, strong feathers. So, a single feather could serve multiple purposes: bedding, fashion, and communication. Talk about versatility. But as with many valuable natural resources, things changed. With the Industrial Revolution, new materials became available. Cotton, wool, and later synthetic fibers began to replace feathers in bedding. Quills were replaced by metal nib pens, and fashion shifted to mass-produced, less expensive alternatives. Suddenly, feathers lost their exclusivity and practicality. What was once the epitome of comfort and status became something ordinary or even unnecessary for most people. You could buy a pillow or a comforter without ever touching a feather, and synthetic materials could mimic the softness and insulation at a fraction of a cost. Yet, feathers didn't disappear entirely. Even today, they remain a popular choice for high-end bedding, jackets, and luxury products. But their symbolic value, the prestige, the status, the connection to wealth, is mostly gone. Most people don't think twice about them, and in many cases, synthetic substitutes dominate because they're cheaper, more consistent, and don't require plucking or killing birds. Something that once represented wealth, comfort, and luxury is now often a casual, everyday material.
It's fascinating when you think about it. People in the past literally invested significant resources, time, money, and labor just to get the softest, warmest feathers for their beds and clothing. Today, we can achieve the same comfort without ever touching a real feather. It's a perfect example of how human innovation and industrialization can change the value of something completely. What was rare, labor-intensive, and prestigious becomes ordinary and replaceable. And here's a fun perspective. Imagine sleeping on a swan feather pillow in a drafty castle in the 1600s. You're warm, soft, and feeling like royalty, while the common folk are tossing and turning on straw-stuffed mattresses. Fast forward a few centuries, and millions of people can sleep comfortably on synthetic pillows without ever knowing the story of the real feathers that used to be the ultimate symbol of luxury. So, next time you snuggle into a fluffy pillow or comforter, take a moment to think about its ancestors. The painstakingly harvested goose and swan feathers that once symbolized wealth, comfort, and status. These humble items that we now take for granted were once treasures of human ingenuity and luxury, carefully collected, cherished, and even fought over. Crazy, right? Something as soft and light as a feather once carried immense value and prestige, and now it's mostly replaced by synthetic materials. It's another reminder that what we consider trash or ordinary today might have been priceless in the past.
Urine. All right, get ready, because this next one is going to make you squirm a little. But stick with me, because it's historically fascinating. We're talking about urine. Yep, that stuff we flush away without a second thought. Today, it's considered waste, pure and simple. But in ancient Rome and in various other cultures, urine was extremely valuable and had a surprising number of practical uses. People literally paid for it, collected it, and relied on it for everyday tasks. Gross? Maybe. Useful? Absolutely. Let's start with leather tanning. Leather is a tough, durable material, but raw animal hides are, well, raw and smelly. To turn them into soft, flexible leather, you need chemicals to remove fats, hair, and other residues. Enter urine. It contains ammonia, a powerful chemical that breaks down proteins in animal hides. Roman tanners would collect urine in large vats, soak the hides in it, and over time, the leather would become supple and ready for crafting into shoes, belts, and armor. Without urine, tanning leather would have been a slow, messy, and expensive process. In fact, urine was so essential that Roman authorities taxed it, literally creating a urine tax because everyone needed it for leather production. That's right, a tax on pee. Imagine that today. But tanning wasn't the only use. Romans also used urine in laundry. Back then, there were no modern detergents, no soap factories, and washing clothes was tough work. Urine, again because of its ammonia content, helped clean fabrics and even whiten them. People would collect urine in public latrines or private homes, soak clothes in it, stomp on them, and then rinse them to remove dirt and stains. It sounds disgusting to us, but at the time, it was an effective cleaning method. In a world without chemical detergents, urine was a critical household tool. And it gets even stranger. Believe it or not, urine was also used in teeth whitening. Ancient Romans were obsessed with dental hygiene and appearances, and they discovered that ammonia could help whiten teeth. So yes, people would rinse their mouths with urine to clean and whiten their teeth. Gross? Absolutely. Effective? Historically, yes. It's one of those moments where human ingenuity crosses the line into, well, creative desperation. Now, here's the really fascinating part. Urine wasn't just a byproduct you ignored. It was a tradable commodity. People would collect it in large jars, sell it to tanners, laundries, and even some cosmetic users. Wealthy households might pay for high-quality urine for delicate tasks like whitening fine fabrics or cleaning luxury items. In Rome, there were even public collection points where citizens could contribute their urine in exchange for small rewards. It was valuable, it circulated in the economy, and it shaped industries. Of course, as disgusting as it seems to us, urine made perfect sense as a resource in a pre-industrial world. It was abundant, chemically useful, and free to collect. Every household produced it, and instead of wasting it, people found practical applications for it. Think about it. Something we now consider pure waste was once an essential tool for cleanliness, fashion, and even health. But eventually, times changed. With the advent of modern chemistry, soap production, and industrial detergents, the need for urine in cleaning and tanning largely disappeared. Leather tanning no longer relied on ammonia-rich urine, and laundry could be done effectively with manufactured soaps. Teeth whitening? Definitely safer alternatives exist now. Suddenly, urine went from treasured commodity to waste product, something you flush without a second thought. It's fascinating to think about the shift in perception. For centuries, urine was a valuable, highly practical resource. People collected it, paid for it, and depended on it. And now, most of us see it as disgusting, inconvenient, and completely worthless. What changed? Technology, chemicals, and sanitation. What once was an essential input for daily life became obsolete and undesirable. And here's a funny perspective. Imagine walking through ancient Rome. Citizens are casually urinating in public collection jars, tanners are stirring vats of pungent liquid to soften leather, laundresses are stomping on pee-soaked clothes, and someone somewhere is rinsing their teeth. It's chaotic, smelly, and weird by today's standards, but it worked. People were resourceful, turning a waste into value in ways that would shock us today. So, next time you think about something worthless or disgusting, remember urine. For centuries, it was a treasured resource, a critical chemical, and a driver of industry. Something we now flush down the drain literally shaped daily life, commerce, and even personal hygiene in ancient societies. It's a reminder that value is contextual. What seems useless or gross today might have been indispensable in the past. Crazy, right? Human history is full of examples where perspective flips our ideas of worth upside down. Urine, something we now associate with waste and disgust, was once prized, taxed, and essential. It helped clean clothes, process leather, and even whiten teeth. Who would have thought that something we flush without a second thought could have been a form of currency, a chemical powerhouse, and an essential household tool all at once? It makes you wonder what modern trash could become tomorrow's treasure. The story of urine is a perfect example of human ingenuity. We look at a waste product and say, how can we turn this into something valuable? And sometimes the answer is as simple and as gross as pee.
Cow dung. All right, brace yourself because this next one is going to get a little stinky. We're talking about cow dung. Yep, the stuff you probably step over in fields or shove into compost piles today. Most of us consider it waste, maybe gross, and definitely smelly. But for centuries, cow dung was extremely valuable, used in ways that were essential for daily life, survival, and even construction. What we see as trash today was once a multifunctional treasure. Let's start with fuel. In many parts of the world, especially rural and agricultural communities, wood wasn't always abundant or easy to come by. People needed fuel for cooking, heating, and sometimes even small-scale industry. Cow dung, when dried, burns surprisingly well. It creates a slow, steady heat, making it perfect for cooking fires or heating homes. In India, Africa, and parts of Europe, people would collect cow dung, mix it with straw, and form it into cakes that could be stacked and dried for later use. Imagine being in a village where winter fires were essential for survival. Cow dung was a lifeline, keeping families warm and kitchens functional. But fuel wasn't the only use. Cow dung was also a building material. Yes, it sounds weird, but people mixed it with mud, straw, and clay to create strong, insulated walls and floors. In some cultures, cow dung-coated floors were polished and used to keep homes clean, repel insects, and even resist moisture. It acted as a natural disinfectant and helped maintain hygiene in homes without modern chemicals. Roofs, too, could be coated with a mixture of cow dung and mud to protect against rain. Essentially, this stinky substance became a critical part of architecture, something that shaped the very homes people lived in for centuries. And of course, cow dung was, and still is, a fertilizer powerhouse. Farmers have long known that animal waste is packed with nutrients that help crops grow. Cow dung contains nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and other elements that enrich the soil. Before chemical fertilizers were invented, it was one of the most effective ways to maintain fertile farmland. People would spread it across fields, sometimes letting it ferment to increase its effectiveness. Without cow dung, agriculture in many regions would have struggled, and food production would have suffered. It literally helped feed entire communities. Now, here's where history gets interesting. Cow dung wasn't just a passive resource. It was actively collected, managed, and even traded. In India, for example, dried dung kegs were sold in markets. In medieval Europe, manure piles were carefully maintained and distributed to nearby farms. People didn't just throw it away. They recognized its value and treated it accordingly. Some villages even had designated dung collectors, whose job was to gather, prepare, and distribute this precious material. What we now think of as disgusting was literally currency in survival and economy. And let's not forget the cultural and religious significance. In some societies, cow dung was, and sometimes still is, considered sacred or purifying. It was used in rituals, to line altars, and even as a protective coating for homes. This added another layer of value, not just practical but symbolic. Something we casually step over today was once a key part of spiritual and daily life, woven into the very fabric of society. Of course, as with many historical treasures, the perception of cow dung changed over time. With the Industrial Revolution and modern technologies, people gained access to coal, natural gas, chemical fertilizer, cement, and other alternatives. Suddenly, cow dung became less critical. Fuel could come from cleaner sources, buildings could be constructed with bricks and cement, and fertilizers could be mass-produced. What was once essential, versatile, and treasured became something mostly ignored or even considered a nuisance. Yet, despite this shift, cow dung hasn't entirely lost its usefulness. Even today, it's used as a natural fertilizer, a source of biofuel, and in some rural construction techniques. And in many traditional practices, it retains its practical and cultural value. But the frenzy and dependence that existed centuries ago, that's mostly gone. What we see as waste today was once indispensable for warmth, shelter, and survival. Here's a little perspective for you. Imagine being a farmer in medieval Europe or rural India centuries ago. You're collecting dried cow dung, stacking it carefully for winter fires, mixing it into mud for walls, and spreading it across fields to grow crops. It's smelly, yes, but it's also power, utility, and security. Losing access to it could mean cold winters, poor crops, and a struggling household. Today, we mostly just smell it and move on. The shift in perception is remarkable. Cow dung is a perfect example of how value is contextual. Something we instinctively label as trash today was once central to life. It was fuel, it was construction material, it was fertilizer, and sometimes even sacred. It shows the humans have always been creative in finding value in what's available, even if that something is smelly and messy. So, next time you step over cow dung into field, think about it for a second. What we now see as worthless was once a lifeline, a currency, a building material, and a fertilizer. It literally shaped homes, farms, and survival strategies. Crazy to think, right? Something we now consider waste literally powered centuries of life, food production, and shelter. In the grand scheme of history, cow dung is a reminder that our perception of value always shifting. What seems disgusting or useless today might have been essential, treasured, or even sacred in the past. And who knows, maybe some of the trash we discard today will be tomorrow's treasure in ways we can't even imagine.
Cigarette butts. All right, this next one is going to make you look at your trash can a little differently. We're talking about cigarette butts. Those tiny, smoldering remnants that most of us just flick away without a second thought. Today, they're considered trash, litter, and even a major environmental problem. But back in the 19th and early 20th centuries, cigarette remnants had a surprising scientific value. They were used in chemical experiments to extract nicotine and other alkaloids, making them more like a resource than waste. So let's rewind to the 1800s. Chemistry was booming. Scientists were exploring new substances, trying to isolate active compounds from plants, and discovering the building blocks of medicines and stimulants. Tobacco, a plant introduced to Europe centuries earlier, was already popular as a recreational substance, but it wasn't just for smoking. Chemists realized that even the leftover tobacco in a cigarette butt contained valuable chemicals, nicotine being the most notable. This was long before synthetic nicotine was available. Every puff of smoke left a trace of alkaloids behind, and these traces could be chemically extracted and studied. Early chemists were fascinated by nicotine because it had potent effects on the human nervous system. Extracting it from used cigarette butts wasn't just a curiosity, it was part of serious research into medicine, toxicology, and even early pharmacology. Nicotine was studied for its stimulant effects, for its toxicity, and eventually for its use in insecticides. In other words, cigarette butts were many chemical laboratories, each one holding a small but measurable amount of bioactive substance. What we casually discard today was once a valuable scientific sample. And the process wasn't trivial. Chemists had to carefully collect cigarette remnants, dry them if necessary, and then use chemical solvents to isolate the alkaloids. It required precision, knowledge of chemical reactions, and patience. Each discarded butt was a tiny treasure chest of information, providing enough nicotine for experiments and analysis, and sometimes even early attempts at medicinal formulations. People didn't just throw these away. In some labs, they were carefully stored, labeled, and used as part of ongoing research projects. Now, you might be wondering, why not just use fresh tobacco? Well, in some cases, used cigarettes were more accessible, especially in urban areas. Think about it. A busy city chemist might have hundreds of cigarette butts discarded daily by smokers. It was an abundant, easy-to-collect resource, whereas fresh tobacco might be expensive or seasonal. The idea of recycling what most people considered trash wasn't just clever, it was a necessity in experimental science. Here's another fun historical angle. Cigarette butts and leftover tobacco were sometimes used for poison studies. Scientists were trying to understand how toxins affect the body, how they could be neutralized, and how certain plants could be used safely. Nicotine was one of the first plant-based alkaloids to be isolated and studied systematically.
And cigarette remnants played a small but crucial role in these discoveries. That's right. What we now see as litter once contributed to the foundations of modern pharmacology and toxicology. Of course, as chemistry advanced and synthetic processes were developed, the value of cigarette butts as a chemical resource declined. Chemists could produce nicotine and other alkaloids in the lab without relying on smoked remnants. By the mid-20th century, cigarette butts were firmly in the trash category. Environmentally harmful, socially frowned upon, and scientifically obsolete. What was once a prized experimental material became a symbol of waste and pollution. It's a perfect example of how value is completely contextual. The same object, a tiny, discarded piece of tobacco, can be treasured in one era and trash in another. Back then, it was a tool for discovery, a chemical sample, a source of knowledge. Today, it's mostly just a smelly nuisance on sidewalks and beaches. Perspective, technology, and social norms completely flipped its perceived worth. And here's a funny thought. Imagine walking through a 19th century chemistry lab. Hundreds of tiny cigarette butts lined up in jars, labeled with dates and notes, carefully extracted with solvents, all to isolate nicotine. Today, the thought of collecting someone's discarded smoke would be gross. Back then, it was cutting-edge science. What seems disgusting or trivial now might have been revolutionary then. So, next time you flick a cigarette butt into a trash can, think about this. Once upon a time, that tiny piece of smoked tobacco could have contributed to scientific experiments, chemical discoveries, and early studies of human biology. It's a reminder that human ingenuity often finds value in the most unexpected places. What we now consider waste was once a resource, and what we dismiss as trash today might be tomorrow's gold. Crazy, right? A discarded cigarette, something people today see as pointless litter, was once part of the cutting edge of chemical research. It helped scientists study nicotine, understand alkaloids, and experiment with compounds that would eventually influence medicine, toxicology, and even agriculture. It's a story that flips our understanding of waste completely. What you toss without a thought might have once been extremely valuable.
Old newspapers. All right, here's one that's probably sitting in a pile somewhere in your house, or maybe you just toss it in the recycling bin without a second thought. Old newspapers. Today, newspapers are considered outdated, disposable, and often just the source of paper waste. But back in the day, old newspapers were extremely valuable and had some surprisingly creative uses. People didn't throw them away. They reused them, sometimes in ways that were essential for comfort, protection, and decoration. Let's start with one of the most practical uses, insulation. Before modern insulation materials like fiberglass, foam, or even bubble wrap existed, people needed cheap, effective ways to keep homes warm. Old newspapers were perfect for this. They could be crumpled, layered, and stuffed into walls, attics, or under floorboards. The paper trapped air, slowed heat transfer, and kept homes warmer in winter. Imagine living in a cold, drafty house in the 1800s or early 1900s. Every scrap of newspaper lining a wall or floor could literally make the difference between freezing and surviving. Something we now recycle as waste was once critical for warmth. And newspapers weren't just used for insulation. They were also packing material. Shipping goods long distances was tricky before bubble wrap, foam peanuts, or cardboard inserts. People discovered that crumpled newspapers could cushion fragile items like glass bottles, ceramics, or household goods. This was especially important in urban areas and for traders sending items by train, horse, or ship. A carefully wrapped package using layers of newspaper could arrive intact, while one without protection might be shattered. So every newspaper, every sheet, Every crumpled page had practical economic value. Here's where it gets even more interesting. Newspapers were sometimes used as wallpaper or interior decoration. In poorer households or in temporary lodgings, lining walls with newspapers added a layer of warmth and even a quirky aesthetic. Some people would paste them in patterns, sometimes leaving the printed text visible, creating a kind of storytelling wallpaper. It was inexpensive, readily available, and served a dual purpose: decoration and insulation. What we now see as trash could be transformed into something both practical and visually interesting. And let's not forget about floor covering and cleaning uses. In muddy or dusty households, newspapers could be laid down to protect floors, especially in kitchens or entryways. When they got dirty, they could be replaced easily. They were absorbent, disposable, and cheap, a kind of early, reusable floor mat. In many ways, newspapers were multi-purpose tools, not just a source of information. They were literally woven into daily life. Even the printed content had some additional value. People often use newspapers as templates, notes, or learning tools. Children might practice writing or drawing on them. Households might use them to wrap gifts or even to start fires. A single newspaper could have multiple lives. First as information, then as insulation, packing, decoration, or even fuel. It was extremely versatile, which is why old newspapers were never seen as worthless. Of course, as technology progressed, the value of newspapers for these practical purposes declined. Modern insulation, packaging materials, wallpaper, and floor coverings replaced newspapers. Printing became cheaper, homes became better insulated, and industrial packaging materials took over. Suddenly, newspapers went from being an everyday resource to mostly disposable item, something to recycle or throw away. What was once treasured for its utility became, in our modern eyes, trash. It's fascinating to think about perspective. For centuries, newspapers were collected, saved, and reused in homes for warmth, protection, and decoration. Today, we glance at a stack of old papers and think, why am I keeping this? In the past, that stack could literally make life easier, warmer, and safer. People were ingenious with what they had, turning the printed sheets of daily life into essential household tools. Here's a funny image. Imagine a 19th century home. Walls lined with newspapers, crumpled pages under the floors, fragile glassware wrapped in sheets of the daily news, and children doodling on old pages while the fireplace crackles nearby. Every newspaper served multiple purposes, and every page was a small but vital resource. Contrast that with today. You're holding the same paper, scrolling through your tablet, and tossing yesterday's edition into recycling. The difference is striking. Newspapers are a perfect example of how value is tied to context. In a world without modern materials, they were treasure. In a world with insulation, packing materials, and decorative options, they are waste. Yet, even now, some people reuse old newspapers creatively for cleaning windows, composting, or art projects, proving that ingenuity can reclaim value in unexpected ways. So next time you see a pile of old newspapers, remember that these sheets were once critical to daily life, used for warmth, protection, decoration, and even play. They weren't disposable. They were practical, essential, and versatile. Something we now consider trash once had immense utility and was woven into homes, workshops, and daily routines. Crazy, right? A stack of old newsprint, something we mostly ignore today, was a household treasure. It kept people warm, protected fragile items, decorated walls, and served countless practical purposes. It's a perfect reminder that human perspective of value can change drastically over time. What we throw away today might have been priceless yesterday.
Broken glass. All right, get ready, because this next one is going to make you look at broken glass in a completely new way.
Yep, the shards you see in trash bins, recycling piles, or scattered across sidewalks weren't always considered worthless. In fact, broken glass was once incredibly valuable because it could be melted down and reused in glassmaking, mirrors, and even artistic creations. What we now call trash was literally part of an industry that shaped homes, art, and technology. Let's rewind to medieval and early modern Europe. Glass was expensive. Windows, mirrors, bottles, and glassware weren't cheap items you could just replace. Each piece of glass was crafted by skilled artisans who spent hours shaping, melting, and polishing raw materials. So imagine dropping a pane of glass or cracking a bottle. Today, you'd throw it away without a thought. But back then, every shard counted. Broken glass was collected carefully because it could be remelted into new products. It was raw material, treasure, and a form of recycling centuries before recycling was even a concept. The process was surprisingly clever. Craftsmen would gather broken glass from households, workshops, and trade centers. They'd sort it by color and quality. Green from bottles, clear from windows, colored fragments from decorative items. Then they would melt it down in furnaces, sometimes mixing it with sand, ash, and other minerals to create new glass. A single batch of melted shards could become a new window, a bottle, or even a decorative piece. Every fragment had potential value, and nothing was wasted. Mirrors were another huge application. Before modern manufacturing, mirrors were rare and expensive. To make them, artisans used thin sheets of glass coated with reflective metals. Broken glass could be repurposed for smaller mirrors, decorative inlays, or even experimental pieces. Some workshops specialized in taking imperfect or broken glass and turning it into usable, sellable products. What we now discard was literally part of the luxury goods industry. Here's a fascinating detail. In some urban areas, there were even glass collecting networks. People would bring broken glass to workshops in exchange for small payments or credit. Households and businesses realized that shards weren't just waste, they were raw material that could be transformed into valuable items. In a world where glass was expensive and labor-intensive, throwing away broken pieces was literally throwing money away. And it wasn't just practical, it was also artistic. In stained glass windows, mosaics, and decorative items, broken glass often found a second life. Craftsmen would carefully select fragments of different colors, shapes, and textures to create patterns and scenes. What looked like trash to some became art in the hands of skilled artisans. A shard of green bottle glass could end up as part of a cathedral window, and a tiny fragment of clear pane could become part of a mirror. The transformation was both practical and creative. Of course, over time, things changed. Industrial glassmaking, cheap mass-produced products, and modern recycling methods shifted the value of broken glass. Today, most glass is melted down in centralized recycling plants, and households rarely think about its potential before tossing it into bins. The personal, artisanal, and locally valuable aspect of broken glass is mostly gone. What was once treasured raw material became everyday recyclables, or trash. Still, even today, broken glass isn't completely useless. Artists, craftspeople, and hobbyists continue to reuse shards for mosaics, jewelry, and decorative items.
Glass recycling plants melt massive quantities of old glass into new bottles and windows. The principle hasn't changed. Glass is endlessly reusable, but the perception of its value has shifted dramatically. From something carefully salvaged in homes and workshops to a piece of generic recyclables, its journey shows how context shapes what we consider valuable. Here's a fun mental image. Imagine a medieval street. Broken bottles and cracked window panes aren't ignored, they're swept up, sorted, and carted to workshops. Artisans heat furnaces, melt shards, and create new bottles, mirrors, and decorative pieces. Every broken fragment had potential, and every household contributed to the supply chain. Contrast that with today. You drop a broken bottle, sweep it into the trash, and that's the end of the story. The value of what was once treasure has disappeared from daily life. Broken glass is a perfect example of how human ingenuity can transform trash into treasure. It wasn't just reused because it was convenient. It was economically, practically, and artistically valuable. Craftsmen, workshops, and households understood that every fragment had potential, and they treated it accordingly. Today, we often fail to see the same potential in the things around us because modern production and abundance have changed our perspective. So next time you encounter a piece of broken glass, think about its past life. Once upon a time, that shard could have been part of a bottle, a window, a mirror, or even a cathedral stained glass. People carefully collected it, valued it, and transformed it into something new. What seems worthless today had once been a crucial resource, part of an economy, an art form, and daily life. Crazy, right? Something as simple as a broken pane of glass, which we now discard without thinking, was once treasured, carefully managed, and creatively repurposed. It's a reminder that value isn't always obvious, and that human ingenuity can turn almost anything we call trash into something extraordinary.
Sea sponges. All right, get ready for something that might make you rethink your shower routine. Sea sponges, yep, the soft, porous things you might find in a bathroom store today, though most of us now grab a synthetic sponge instead. But back in the ancient Mediterranean, natural sea sponges were luxury items, highly prized for bathing, cleaning, and even artistic uses. What we now consider a simple household product was once a symbol of comfort, hygiene, and status. Let's go back about 2,000 years. Picture a Mediterranean port city, Athens, Rome, or Carthage. The wealthy elite are enjoying baths in lavish stone or marble tubs, filled with warm water and scented oils. But bathing wasn't just about water, it was about experience and cleanliness, and the tools mattered. Enter the sea sponge, soft, absorbent, and perfect for gently cleansing skin. Unlike rough plant materials or cloth, a sea sponge offered a luxurious, almost pampering touch. People paid top coin for the best specimens, which were harvested carefully from the sea. Sea sponges weren't just luxury because they felt good. They were also rare and difficult to obtain. Harvesting them required diving into the Mediterranean, often at significant personal risk. Divers had to locate the sponges, detach them from rocky seabeds, and surface without damaging the delicate structures. The best sponges were large, uniform, and resilient, perfect for baths, scrubbing, or even applying cosmetics. Because they were difficult to harvest and in high demand, they commanded high prices. A sponge wasn't just a cleaning tube, it was a status symbol. And here's where it gets really interesting. Sea sponges had multiple uses beyond bathing. Artisans used them for applying paints, dyes, and plaster.
Some medical practitioners used them in early surgical or cleaning procedures, appreciating their absorbent qualities. Wealthy households might even display them as curiosities, a natural marvel of the sea. In short, sea sponges were versatile treasures bridging hygiene, art, and prestige. Contrast that with today. Modern synthetic sponges, cheap, uniform, and mass-produced, have largely replaced natural sea sponges. They're consistent in shape, durable, and easy to make in factories. The luxury, rarity, and artisanal value of the original sea sponges is mostly gone. People still buy natural sponges occasionally, but the majority of household sponges are now synthetic, disposable, and far less exciting. What was once a prized item for the elite is now a common commodity you can grab for a few dollars at a supermarket. It's fascinating when you think about how perceptions change. The same object, soft, absorbent, and functional, can be a luxury treasure in one era and a cheap disposable product in another. Ancient Mediterranean societies recognized the value of natural sponges in ways we rarely consider today. They were expensive, sought after, and status-defining. Now, most of us barely notice what kind of sponge we use in the shower, unless we're specifically looking for the natural kind. And here's another angle. Harvesting sea sponges was a skilled craft. Divers knew the best locations, how to handle the sponges without destroying them, and when to harvest to ensure sustainability. In a way, natural sponges were eco-conscious luxury items before eco-conscious even existed. People understood the delicate balance between using the sea's resources and keeping them available. That expertise added even more value to the sponges. They weren't just soft, they were carefully curated and expertly harvested. Let's imagine the scene. A Roman bathhouse, sunlight streaming through the columns, the scent of oils in the air, and attendants gently scrubbing the wealthy patrons with large, luxurious sea sponges. Every sponge used in that bath was valuable, not just because of what it did, but because of what it represented: wealth, sophistication, and the luxury of caring for your body in a way most people couldn't afford. Fast forward to today, and most of us use synthetic sponges to wash dishes or showers, rarely considering the fascinating history of the natural versions. Sea sponges are also a reminder of human ingenuity and adaptation. People recognized the unique qualities of natural sponges, their softness, absorbency, and resilience, and incorporated them into everyday life, from bathing to painting to cleaning delicate items. That's a pattern we see over and over in history. Humans taking natural resources that others might ignore and turning them into prized commodities. So, next time you see a sponge, whether it's synthetic or natural, think about this. For centuries, sea sponges were luxury items, carefully harvested, highly valued, and a symbol of hygiene and status. They weren't just cleaning tools. They were treasured objects that reflected skill, wealth, and taste. What we now see as ordinary was once extraordinary. Crazy, right? Something as simple as a sponge could define comfort, prestige, and skill in ancient societies. Today, it's just part of everyday cleaning. But history shows that even ordinary-seeming objects can have incredible value, depending on time, context, and human ingenuity. Sea sponges are a soft, squishy reminder that what we discard today or take for granted might have been a treasure in the past. Fish scales. All right, get ready, because this next one might make you look at your seafood leftovers in a totally different way. We're talking about fish scales. Yep, those tiny, shiny little things most people scrape off and toss without a thought. Today, they're pretty much considered waste. But back in the day, fish scales were extremely valuable and used in ways that were surprisingly glamorous. They weren't just leftovers from dinner, they were part of cosmetics, jewelry, and artistic craftsmanship. Let's start with the cosmetic side. In many ancient cultures, especially in East Asia, fish scales were prized for their iridescence. People ground them into a fine powder to create shimmering effects in makeup, especially for skin, lips, and even eyes. This was long before modern glitter, mica powders, or synthetic pigments existed. The tiny reflective surfaces of fish scales gave a natural sparkle, which could be mixed with oils, waxes, or other ingredients to produce luxurious cosmetics. Imagine ancient markets full of jars of crushed scales, ready to make wealthy women or men glow in candlelight. Something we now throw away was literally a luxury beauty ingredient. And it wasn't just for cosmetics. Fish scales also found their way into jewelry and decorative items. Their shiny, reflective quality made them perfect for embellishing necklaces, hair pieces, brooches, or even clothing. In some cultures, artisans would embed fish scales into metal or lacquer to create intricate patterns and shimmering textures. The effect was subtle but striking, like a natural iridescent mosaic. To the people wearing them, fish scales weren't trash. They were a way to signal wealth, taste, and artistic sensibility. Here's a fun detail. Some cultures even used dried fish scales as a kind of currency in local trades. Not in the sense of money, like coins, but as a tradable luxury item that artisans and merchants prized. A fisher could sell their scales to a craftsperson who would turn them into something decorative or cosmetic, and the value was significantly higher than the scale's original worth as part of a fish. It's a perfect example of how humans turn what seems like waste into high-value material. And it wasn't just about shimmer. Fish scales were also used in art and ornamentation. They were applied to paintings, lacquerware, and ceremonial objects. Sometimes they were layered to imitate the look of mother-of-pearl or to create reflective surfaces that caught sunlight in dazzling ways. A single fish, discarded after a meal, could provide scales that might decorate a piece of art or a ceremonial costume. That's pretty remarkable when you think about it. Contrast that with today. Most people remove fish scales to get to the meat and toss them straight into compost or trash. Their shiny potential is largely ignored. Synthetic alternatives, glitter, sequins, mica powders have replaced fish scales in cosmetics and decoration. The practicality and artistry of using natural scales is mostly forgotten. What was once a luxury and a craft material is now considered disposable waste. Here's a fascinating perspective. Imagine a bustling ancient marketplace. Fishers are selling their catch, and alongside the fresh fish, artisans are snapping up scales. One set of scales goes into a sparkling eyeshadow, another becomes part of a ceremonial hairpiece, and yet another is woven into decorative lacquerware. Every discarded part of the fish has a potential second life. In a world without synthetic materials, nothing went to waste, especially something as aesthetically unique as fish scales. Fish scales are also a reminder of human ingenuity. People noticed the natural shimmer, the reflective quality, and the flexibility of scales, and they found ways to incorporate them into beauty, art, and fashion. It's a pattern you see throughout history. What seems like trash is often a hidden resource, waiting for someone creative enough to realize its potential. So, next time you eat fish or see a pile of scales, think about this. For centuries, these tiny, discarded bits were luxury cosmetic ingredients, jewelry embellishments, and art materials. They weren't garbage. They were raw materials for beauty and craft, transforming everyday meals into sources of creativity and wealth. Crazy, right? Something as small and seemingly insignificant as fish scales could create sparkle for cosmetics, shine in jewelry, and add magic to art.
Today, we barely notice them and throw them away without thinking. But in the past, they were prized, valuable, and versatile. A perfect example of how humans turn waste into treasure.
Coal dust. All right, let's dive into something that's a little grimy, but historically powerful. Coal dust. Yep, that fine black powder that collects around mines or spills from coal sacks. Today, most of us think of it as messy, dirty, or even hazardous. But in the past, coal dust was extremely valuable, collected carefully, and used in ways that helped power homes, industries, and even entire economies. What we now mostly overlook was once a crucial resource. Let's start with the obvious use: fuel. Coal dust is essentially a finely ground form of coal, which makes it burn more easily and evenly than large chunks. Miners and industrial workers discovered that instead of wasting these tiny particles, they could collect them and compress them into briquettes, small, solid fuel blocks. These briquettes were perfect for stoves, small furnaces, and home heating. In a world before electricity and modern heating, every bit of burnable material counted. Coal dust wasn't just scrap, it was heat, energy, and survival during cold winters. And here's the clever part. Coal dust briquettes were sometimes made by mixing the powder with clay, sawdust, or other binders, then pressing them into shape. This not only recycled otherwise wasted material, but also extended the fuel supply for households and factories. Imagine a busy industrial town in the 19th century, furnaces roaring, homes heating, and miners collecting every speck of coal to make it go further. Every handful of dust was literally money in warmth and productivity. Coal dust also found applications beyond heating. In some industries, it was used in metallurgy and smelting processes. Its fine, uniform texture allowed it to burn consistently in small-scale metal furnaces or for processes that required controlled heat. This was important for blacksmithing, metalworking, and other industrial applications. People didn't just discard coal dust, they recognized its value as a precise, versatile fuel source. Here's a fascinating fact. In some regions, miners would collect coal dust from the floor and walls of the mines, sweep it into containers, and sell it separately. Households would buy it specifically to make briquettes or to sprinkle into furnaces for even heat. What we now think of as a byproduct or nuisance was actually an economically important commodity. Miners and families both profited from using something that would have otherwise gone to waste. And the ingenuity doesn't stop there. Coal dust was sometimes mixed with other materials to create industrial products, like carbon black, which was used in inks, paints, and rubber production. In these applications, the dust's fine particle size and high carbon content made it extremely valuable. A material that seems dirty or useless to us today was a key input for art, industry, and manufacturing. Contrast that with today. Modern industries rely on standardized fuels, electricity, and synthetic carbon sources. Coal dust is still used in some industrial processes, but in everyday life, most of it is overlooked or even considered a hazardous waste. People don't collect it for home stoves, and mining operations focus on bulk coal rather than at every speck of dust. What was once a treasured byproduct has largely been ignored thanks to new technologies and fuels. Here's a visual for you. Imagine a 19th century mining town. Miners carefully sweeping the floors for stray coal dust, families buying dust to make briquettes for their stoves, and factories using it to control furnace heat.
Every tiny particle mattered, and no one would waste it. Fast forward to today, and those same particles are mostly airborne pollutants or industrial residue, largely discarded without thought. The context completely changes how we perceive value. Coal dust is a great example of human resourcefulness. People noticed a waste product and turned it into something useful, practical, and even economically important. It shows how humans have always been clever at turning what others ignore into a critical tool for survival and progress. So next time you think of coal dust as nothing more than a black mess, remember this. In history, it was fuel, warmth, industrial input, and economic resources. People collected it, used it creatively, and transformed it into briquettes, industrial materials, and even art-related products. What seems useless today was once essential, valuable, and carefully managed. Crazy, right? That fine black powder lying around mines and homes had immense value in the past. It heated homes, powered furnaces, and even contributed to industrial processes. Today, we sweep it aside or call it a nuisance. But history shows that even the smallest, dustiest leftovers can be treasures in the right context. Coal dust is a perfect reminder that value is often hidden in plain sight. We just have to know how to see it.
Cork scraps. All right, let's talk about something that seems harmless and maybe even boring at first. Cork scraps. Those leftover bits of cork from bottle stoppers, flooring, or craft projects. Today, most of us barely notice them. We might toss them, compost them, or ignore them entirely. But for centuries, cork scraps were surprisingly valuable, used for floats, insulation, and even as cheap tools for everyday life. What we consider trash today was once a practical and versatile material that people relied on. Let's start with the most obvious use: floats for fishing nets and lines. Cork is naturally buoyant, lightweight, and durable. Fishermen quickly realized that even the smallest leftover cork pieces could be repurposed to keep nets afloat or mark lines in the water. Instead of wasting scraps from cork stoppers or construction, they'd bundle or shape them into mini buoys. In a world without modern plastics or synthetic materials, every piece of cork counted. A fisherman could save time, money, and resources simply by using what others might discard. And it wasn't just about fishing. Cork scraps were also used as insulation material. Cork is an excellent natural insulator. It resists moisture, maintains temperature, and is lightweight. People would stuff cork scraps into walls, attics, or floors to reduce drafts and retain heat. Before synthetic insulation, these seemingly insignificant leftovers played a big role in household comfort. Imagine a cold winter in rural Europe or the Mediterranean. Every bit of cork that lined walls or ceilings helped keep families warm. Something we now see as waste was literally protecting homes and saving energy. Cork scraps also found use in everyday items like bottle stoppers, seals, and small plugs. Instead of crafting new cork pieces from scratch, people would repurpose scraps to seal bottles of wine, oil, or water. It was practical, efficient, and economical. Households and small workshops understood the value of recycling materials. They didn't throw away what could still serve a purpose. Even the tiniest scrap could be useful. Here's a fun historical detail. Cork was so valuable that in some areas, scraps were collected and traded. Artisans, fishermen, and households would save leftover pieces to sell or barter with neighbors. It might seem small, but in a time when every resource was precious, cork scraps were worth keeping, not tossing.
They had tangible utility and could even contribute to household income or craft production. And the creativity doesn't stop there. People discovered countless ways to use cork scraps for crafts and decoration. They could be glued, carved, or assembled into trivets, coasters, toys, or simple art projects. Even in luxury households, scraps weren't seen as useless. They were raw material for small, practical, or decorative creations. Cork's flexibility and resilience made it a perfect multi-purpose resource. Contrast that with today. Modern synthetic materials, foam, plastics, and industrial insulation have largely replaced cork in many applications. Most leftover scraps are discarded, ground into pellets for industrial use, or simply ignored. The careful collection and creative reuse of cork that existed for centuries is mostly forgotten. What was once a versatile, valuable resource is now largely overlooked. Imagine a mental image. A Mediterranean fisherman finishing repairs on his net, carefully saving tiny bits of cork from old stoppers. A family stuffing cork scraps into walls to keep the house warm. An artisan crafting simple coasters from leftover bits. Every scrap had a purpose, and none went to waste. Compare that to today, when leftover cork often ends up in landfills or recycling bins. It's a huge shift in perception and practice. Cork scraps are a perfect example of human ingenuity and resourcefulness. People took what seemed like waste and turned it into something practical, functional, and sometimes even beautiful. They recognized the value in small, leftover materials and found ways to integrate them into everyday life. This mindset, seeing treasure in what others discard, is something that continues to inspire sustainability and creativity today. So next time you see cork scraps, whether from wine bottles, crafts, or flooring, remember their history. For centuries, these small leftovers were critical tools for fishing, insulation, sealing, and creativity. They weren't trash, they were versatile, functional, and valued resources that people actively collected and reused. Crazy, right? Something as tiny and seemingly insignificant as a cork scrap had immense practical value. It kept nets afloat, homes insulated, and bottles sealed. Today, most people ignore them. But history shows that even the smallest leftovers can be transformed into useful, indispensable tools. Cork scraps are a soft, lightweight reminder that what we throw away today might have been a treasure in the past, and maybe still could be if we know how to use it.
Wine dregs. All right, let's dive into something that might make you look at your leftover wine differently. Wine dregs. Yep, those sludgy bits that settle at the bottom of a bottle after drinking or fermenting. Today, most people just toss them or ignore them, maybe swish them down the sink without thinking. But back in history, wine dregs were surprisingly valuable, used to make vinegar, pigments, and even medicinal extracts. What we now consider waste was once a multi-purpose resource that people relied on. Let's start with the most obvious use, vinegar. Before modern chemical processes, vinegar wasn't something you could buy cheaply in a store. People relied on fermentation to produce it, and wine dregs were a perfect starting material. The leftover yeast, sediment, and partially fermented liquid could be left to continue fermenting into vinegar. Households, taverns, and merchants all recognized that what seemed like waste could become a useful, preservable liquid. Vinegar was essential not only for cooking, but also for cleaning, preserving food, and even medicinal purposes. So a pile of wine dregs wasn't trash, it was raw material for something valuable. But wine dregs weren't just for vinegar.
They were also used to create pigments and dyes. The rich red sediment from red wine could be dried and powdered to make natural pigments for painting, decorating fabrics, or illuminating manuscripts. Artists, scribes, and craftsmen often relied on natural sources for color, and wine dregs provided a deep, vibrant red. In a time before synthetic dyes, these leftovers weren't just trash, they were tools for art and expression. Imagine an artist grinding wine sediment into powder to mix with gum arabic or oil, producing beautiful shades for manuscripts, paintings, or textiles. What was waste to a diner or tavern keeper became artistic gold in the hands of a creative mind. And here's another fascinating use: medicinal extracts. Ancient and medieval practitioners often experimented with wine dregs as remedies. Because the sediment contained yeast, tannins, acids, and other compounds, people used it for digestive health, minor infections, or topical applications. Wine itself was already associated with health benefits, and the dregs were considered a concentrated, medicinally useful portion. People didn't just pour it down the drain, they integrated it into remedies, salves, and treatments. It was a mix of chemistry, folk medicine, and practical resourcefulness. There's also a social and economic angle. Wine dregs were often collected, traded, or sold. Taverns, wineries, and households recognized their potential value. A barrel of wine dregs could be transformed into vinegar for cooking, pigment for art, or a basic medicinal extract, something that could be consumed, sold, or used to produce further goods. What seems like leftovers were actually commodities with multiple revenue streams. Contrast that with today. Most of us pour out the sediment, rinse the bottle, and move on. Synthetic dyes replaced wine pigments, mass-produced vinegar replaced home-fermented vinegar, and modern medicine replaced simple wine-based remedies. The careful collection and creative reuse of wine dregs has mostly disappeared. Today, wine dregs are largely ignored, treated as byproducts with little value, despite their fascinating historical roles. Here's a visual for you. Imagine a medieval kitchen or apothecary. Barrels of wine dregs sit in a corner. One batch ferments slowly into vinegar. Another is dried and ground into red pigment for a manuscript. A small portion is simmered into a medicinal extract for a patient with stomach troubles. Every bit of sediment has a purpose, and nothing is wasted. Contrast that with today, when that same material might be scraped off and thrown in the compost or down the drain. The context completely flips how we perceive its value. Wine dregs are also a great example of human ingenuity. People noticed potential in what others considered waste. They experimented with chemical changes, fermentation, and extraction, turning sediment into something useful and versatile. They recognized hidden value in leftovers and found ways to integrate them into daily life, commerce, and creative work. So next time you see wine dregs settling in a bottle, think about this. For centuries, these leftovers were tools for survival, creativity, and medicine. They weren't just trash, they were vinegar, pigments, remedies, and valuable resources that people carefully collected and reused. Crazy, right? Something as small and seemingly insignificant as the sediment at the bottom of a wine bottle had immense practical value. It could flavor food, color art, or contribute to medicine. Today, we ignore it, but history shows that even what we call waste can have multiple surprising uses. Wine dregs are a liquid reminder that human creativity and resourcefulness often turn the ordinary or the discarded into something extraordinary.
Old leather scraps. All right, get ready for something you might overlook in a workshop or attic. Old leather scraps. Yep, those leftover bits from shoes, bags, belts, or armor. Today, most of us toss them, maybe donate them, or ignore them entirely. But throughout history, leather scraps were extremely valuable and repurposed in ways that kept people clothed, armed, and even safe. What we now consider waste was once a crucial material that played a role in daily life, trade, and even warfare. Let's start with the most practical use: shoe repair and new footwear. In times before mass-produced shoes, leather was expensive. Craftsmen and households saved every scrap to patch worn shoes, create insoles, or even fashion smaller shoes for children. Nothing was wasted. A tiny leftover piece could extend the life of footwear by months or even years. Imagine a medieval or early modern household carefully sorting scraps, knowing that every bit of leather could protect someone's feet. What we now discard as useless could literally save money and provide comfort. Leather scraps were also used for belts, straps, and simple clothing accessories. A leftover strip could be turned into a belt for a child, a strap for a bag, or a patch for a jacket. Craftsmen learned to stretch, stitch, and mold scraps creatively. In some communities, leather scraps were even traded as raw material for cobblers and leather workers who could transform them into useful goods. Every tiny piece had potential value. It wasn't just a leftover, it was raw material for survival and utility. And here's where it gets even more interesting. In military context, leather scraps were used for artillery padding, armor reinforcement, and protective gear. Cannons and early firearms were rough, dangerous tools, and padding made from leftover leather could protect soldiers, equipment, or cargo. Even in armored units, small scraps were patched onto existing gear to extend its lifespan or enhance protection. A tiny piece of leather could make the difference between injury and safety. What seems like a scrap in a modern workshop was an essential piece of battlefield ingenuity. Leather scraps also had artistic and practical applications. Artisans used them for bookbinding, tool handles, and decorative items. They were pliable, durable, and easy to shape. In some cases, leftover leather was dyed or embossed to make accents for furniture, ceremonial objects, or religious items. Craftspeople understood that small pieces could add both function and beauty to everyday life. Contrast that with today. Modern synthetic materials, cheap, mass-produced leather, and industrial adhesives mean that most scraps are ignored, shredded, or sent to recycling plants. We no longer rely on every tiny piece to patch shoes, reinforce armor, or create durable tools. What was once carefully collected and repurposed has largely been replaced by convenience and mass production. Here's a mental picture. Imagine a medieval cobbler's workshop. Strips of leather are hanging, sorted by size, thickness, and quality. Craftsmen carefully select scraps to patch shoes, reinforce belts, or create protective padding for soldiers. Nothing is wasted, and each piece has a clear purpose. Contrast that with a modern leather factory, where small scraps are collected for recycling or discarded. The same material, but the context and perceived value have completely changed. Old leather scraps also show us human resourcefulness in action. People noticed potential where others saw waste. They experimented with cutting, stitching, molding, and reinforcing, turning leftover material into something useful and durable. Every scrap became part of a larger economy of household utility, trade, and even military preparedness.
It's a perfect example of how humans turn discarded material into treasure. So, next time you see old leather scraps, whether from shoes, bags, jackets, or furniture, think about this. For centuries, these remnants were tools for protection, utility, and artistry. They weren't trash. They were valuable resources that could extend life, provide comfort, and even save lives. Crazy, right? Something as small and seemingly insignificant as a leftover piece of leather had immense practical value. It could patch a shoe, reinforce armor, or become part of a beautiful craft. Today, we ignore it, but history shows that even what we call waste can have critical, versatile uses. Old leather scraps are a tough, flexible reminder that human ingenuity often transforms what seems worthless into something essential. Sawdust from aromatic woods. All right, get ready, because this next one is going to make you see sawdust in a completely different light. Yep, that fine powder left over when cutting or sanding wood. Most of us just sweep it up and toss it. But not all sawdust is created equal. Sawdust from aromatic woods, think sandalwood, cedar, or agouti, was once extremely valuable, used to make incense, perfumes, and even ritual items. What seemed like leftover shavings was actually a fragrant treasure. Now, let's travel back a few centuries. Picture an ancient temple or royal court in Asia, the Middle East, or Europe. People weren't just interested in building with wood, they were drawn to its scent and properties. Aromatic woods were prized for the smell they imparted when burned, and craftsmen quickly realized that even the leftover shavings could be repurposed. Instead of discarding sawdust, they collected it carefully to create incense sticks, cones, powders, or perfumes. A pile of sawdust that we would call trash was essential for religious, ceremonial, and everyday luxury practices. Sawdust from these woods wasn't just burned, it was processed for fragrances. In some cases, it was dried, powdered, and mixed with resins, oils, or other aromatic compounds to produce incense for temples or homes. In other cases, perfumers used the fine particles to extract essential oils or create fragrant powders. Imagine ancient artisans grinding tiny shavings of sandalwood into a fine dust, blending it with other materials, and creating scents that would fill palaces, temples, or marketplaces. What we now sweep into trash bins was the key ingredient for luxury fragrances. And it wasn't just for smell. It had ritual and cultural significance. In many cultures, incense played a role in meditation, prayer, or ceremonial practices. Using aromatic wood sawdust allowed people to make these rituals more accessible. Instead of discarding shavings from woodworking projects, people transformed them into spiritual tools, connecting daily craft with sacred practices. It's wild to think that what seems like a simple byproduct was intertwined with spirituality, culture, and luxury. Here's another fascinating detail. Some aromatic wood sawdust was traded as a commodity. In marketplaces, powdered sandalwood or cedar shavings could fetch high prices. Artisans, carpenters, and traders recognized that these leftovers weren't waste. They were raw material for perfumes, incense, and ritual items that wealthy households and temples were willing to pay for. A handful of shavings could be worth far more than their weight in ordinary wood. Contrast that with today. Modern perfumery relies on synthetic fragrances, and incense is often mass-produced from non-aromatic woods or artificial compounds. Most woodworking sawdust is either burned, composted, or discarded. The careful collection and creative reuse of aromatic shavings has largely disappeared. What was once a fragrant, valuable byproduct is now mostly overlooked or treated as waste. Here's a mental picture. Imagine an ancient carpenter's workshop. Workers are building a cedar cabinet. Shavings fall to the floor, and instead of discarding them, an apprentice collects them carefully into jars. Later, those shavings will be mixed with resins and oils to make incense for a temple ceremony, or ground into a fine powder for a perfumer. Every tiny flake of wood has potential value, both practical and spiritual. Compare that with a modern woodworking shop, where sawdust is simply swept into a pile. Same material, but entirely different perceived value. Sawdust from aromatic woods is also a great example of human ingenuity. People noticed the properties of natural materials and found ways to extract value from leftovers. It wasn't just about saving resources, it was about maximizing utility and integrating craft, commerce, and culture. A tiny flake of sandalwood could become a spiritual tool, a luxury fragrance, or a traded commodity, demonstrating that waste in one context can be treasure in another. So next time you see sawdust, especially from fragrant woods, think about this. For centuries, these leftovers were raw material for incense, perfumes, and spiritual practices. They weren't just dust. They were aromatic treasures, carefully collected and transformed by artisans and traders. Crazy, right? Something as tiny and seemingly insignificant as wood shavings could create scents that filled temples, palaces, and homes. Today, we barely notice sawdust, yet history shows that even the smallest byproducts can have luxury, cultural, and economic value.
Rice husks. All right, let's talk about something that most of us toss aside without a second thought. Rice husks. Yep, the thin, dry shells that protect each grain of rice. After milling, they're usually treated as waste. But throughout history, rice husks were incredibly valuable, used as fuel, fertilizer, and even early building materials. What seems like a byproduct today was once a multi-purpose resource critical to survival and industry. Let's start with the most obvious use: fuel. In regions where rice was a staple, like Southeast Asia, China, and India, rice husks were collected and burned to cook food, heat homes, or power small furnaces. They burn efficiently and were readily available, making them an accessible source of energy for households that didn't have easy access to wood or coal. Farmers and families understood that every batch of rice provided not just nutrition, but also a source of fuel, something we often overlook today. And rice husks weren't just fuel, they were excellent fertilizer. After being burned into ash or composted directly, they added nutrients back into the soil. In regions with intensive rice cultivation, recycling husks into the fields helped maintain soil health, increase crop yields, and reduce waste. It was a practical, eco-friendly way to maximize resources, long before modern fertilizers were available. Farmers recognized the value in what others might call trash. Here's a surprising one. Rice husks were even used in early building materials. When mixed with mud, clay, or lime, husks could strengthen bricks, create lightweight insulation, or act as filler in construction. In some communities, they helped make walls more resistant to cracking, provided natural insulation, and even reduced moisture problems. Imagine a small village in the past where every sack of rice brought not just food, but also the raw material for houses, ovens, or fences. What we see as leftovers today was once structurally significant. Rice husks were also used in everyday household items. In some cases, they were packed into bedding for extra cushioning, used as packing material to protect fragile goods, or even combined with other fibers to make mats and brushes. The husk's light, fibrous texture made them surprisingly versatile, and families would collect them carefully instead of discarding them. Every harvest produced multiple types of resources, demonstrating the human knack for resourcefulness. And let's not forget the economic angle. In some regions, rice husks were collected, sold, or bartered.
Farmers who had extra husks could sell them to brick makers, fuel suppliers, or other villagers who needed them for construction or energy. A material that might seem worthless in one household became a tradable commodity in another. History is full of these examples, where waste had hidden value, and rice husks are a perfect example. Contrast that with today. Modern agriculture and energy systems treat rice husks mostly as industrial byproducts. They are sometimes burned for electricity, converted into biochar, or used in manufacturing. But the everyday uses that were once common, fueling for cooking, bedding, building materials, are mostly gone. Most households don't even think twice about them. They're swept away, composted, or discarded. The careful collection and creative reuse that sustained generations is largely forgotten. Here's a mental image. A small, rural village in Southeast Asia. Families finish milling rice for the day, then carefully gather the husks. Some are burned for cooking, some are sprinkled onto fields to improve soil, and some are mixed with mud to patch walls or make small bricks. Every grain of rice leaves behind a husk with multiple purposes. Nothing goes to waste, and every byproduct has practical and economic value. Compare that to today, when most rice husks are treated as mere industrial residue. Rice husks are also a testament to human ingenuity. People saw value in something others considered worthless and found ways to integrate it into daily life, agriculture, and construction. They weren't just waste collectors. They were early engineers, chemists, and sustainability experts. Every handful of rice husks had multiple potential uses, reflecting the practical intelligence of past societies. So next time you see rice husks, whether from milling, cooking, or packaged rice, think about this. For centuries, they were fuel, fertilizer, building material, and household resources. They weren't trash, they were versatile, valuable, and essential to survival and everyday life. Crazy, right? Something as thin and seemingly insignificant as a rice husk could feed the fire, nourish the soil, and even strengthen a wall. Today, we mostly overlook them, yet history shows that even byproducts we discard can have practical, economic, and structural value. Rice husks are a humble reminder that human creativity can transform the ordinary or discarded into something extraordinary.
Human hair. All right, this next one might make you squirm a little, but bear with me because we're talking about human hair. Yep, the stuff you shed in the shower, on your brush, or when you get a haircut. Today, most of us toss it without a second thought, maybe flush it down the sink or throw it in the trash. But throughout history, human hair was extremely valuable, used for wigs, brushes, and even fishing lines. What seems like a personal nuisance today was once a prized resource with practical and luxury uses. Let's start with the most obvious one: wigs. In Europe, especially from the 17th century onwards, wigs were the height of fashion. People wore them to display social status, cover hair loss, or simply follow the latest trends. Wigs weren't made from synthetic fibers back then. They were crafted from real human hair, often sourced from donors, barbers, or hair markets. The longer, thicker, and cleaner the hair, the more valuable it was. Stray hair that we would normally ignore could become a luxurious wig, capable of transforming someone's appearance entirely. Imagine a bustling wig market where human hair is sorted by color, texture, and length. Each strand a small piece of luxury waiting to be turned into fashion. Human hair wasn't just for fashion, it was practical too. Brushes, for instance, were made with carefully collected hair. Artists, tailors, and everyday households relied on hair-bristled brushes for painting, cleaning, or grooming.
Hair's natural flexibility, strength, and resilience made it perfect for precise and durable bristles. A handful of hair from a salon, a barber, or a hair market could be transformed into something functional and long-lasting, turning what we might consider trash into a tool people depended on. And here's a surprising one. Hair was even used in fishing lines and nets. In some cultures, strands of human hair were braided or twisted into lines that were fine but strong enough to catch small fish. Of course, synthetic lines and plant fibers eventually replaced this use, but for centuries, hair was a practical, low-cost material for fishing communities. Imagine a small riverside village with locals twisting long hair into fine lines that would help feed their families. What we flush away today was once a vital survival material. There's also an economic and social angle. Hair was often collected, traded, and sold. In some cities, barbers would sell collected hair to wig makers. Wigs could then be sold for significant amounts of money, making hair a commodity with tangible value. Even short scraps might be bundled into brushes, while long strands went into high-end wigs. Hair wasn't just personal, it was currency in craftsmanship and fashion. Contrast that with today. Modern wigs, brushes, and fishing lines rely mostly on synthetic materials. Human hair is still used for high-end wigs, but most of the hair we shed in daily life is treated as waste. The centuries-old system of careful collection, sorting, and repurposing is mostly gone. A strand of hair that could once provide utility or luxury now ends up ignored or discarded. Here's a mental picture. Imagine a 17th century wig market in Paris or London. Long, flowing hair is sorted by color, texture, and length. Some strands go to wig makers, some are used to craft brushes, and a few even end up braided for fishing lines in distant villages. Every strand has potential, and nothing is wasted. Compare that to today, where hair is mostly swept away after a haircut. Same material, completely different perceived value. Human hair is also a fascinating example of human ingenuity. People noticed the strength, texture, and flexibility of hair and found ways to integrate it into fashion, household tools, and survival needs. They didn't just discard it. They transformed it into something valuable, practical, and socially significant. Even something as personal and disposable as hair became part of commerce, craft, and culture. So, next time you see hair on your brush, on the floor, or in the sink, think about this. For centuries, human hair was a tool, a luxury material, and a vital resource. It wasn't just waste. It was wigs, brushes, and fishing lines, carefully collected and transformed by human ingenuity. Crazy, right? Something as everyday and seemingly insignificant as a strand of hair had immense practical, economic, and social value. Today, we mostly ignore it. But history shows that even what we consider waste can have multiple, surprising uses. Human hair is a tactile, personal reminder that value is often hidden in the ordinary, and what we toss away today could have been treasured yesterday.
Old candles. All right, let's dive into something that might light up your imagination. Old candles. Yep, the half-burned, misshapen candles that are lying around the house, maybe in a drawer or on a shelf. Today, most of us just throw them out or leave them to collect dust. But for centuries, old candles were incredibly valuable. They were melted down to make new candles, providing light, warmth, and even social status. What we now consider waste was once an essential resource that kept homes bright and fires burning.
Let's start with the most obvious use, recycling into new candles. Before cheap paraffin and mass production, wax was expensive and precious. People couldn't just buy a new candle every week. Instead, households would collect every leftover candle stub, chip, or drip and melt it down to form new candles. A tiny stub might be too small to use alone, but when combined with others, it could create a full-sized candle ready to light a home. What we now see as useless or burnt out was raw material for survival and convenience. And it wasn't just about quantity, it was about quality and resourcefulness. People would carefully sort candles by type, beeswax, tallow, or other natural waxes, because the melting properties and scent mattered. Beeswax candles burned longer and cleaner, and melting leftover bits allowed families to stretch their resources while keeping quality intact. The process of recycling stubs wasn't just practical, it was an essential household skill. Families learned to value every bit of wax, turning potential waste into functional, valuable light sources. Here's another fascinating use: charity and trade. In some communities, collected candle stubs were given to churches, monasteries, or craft workshops. These institutions could melt down the wax to produce new candles for religious ceremonies, festivals, or even sale. Old candles weren't just reused at home, they had social and economic significance, enabling communities to maximize scarce resources. A pile of waste in one household could become the main supply for a church altar or festival celebration. Old candles were also part of technological ingenuity. Candle makers developed clever techniques for melting, straining, and reforming wax. They learned how to combine different types of leftover wax to achieve consistent burning and scent, and even how to mold candles into decorative shapes. This recycling wasn't just about saving money, it was a craft in itself, blending practicality, aesthetics, and tradition. Contrast that with today. Modern paraffin, soy, and synthetic waxes are cheap, mass-produced, and widely available. Most households toss old candles or leave them to melt messily in drawers. The careful collection and recycling that was once standard practice has mostly disappeared. A candle stub that used to be melted and reused is now ignored or discarded, reflecting how technology change can transform what we value or don't. Old candles are also a great example of human ingenuity and sustainability. People noticed potential in what others considered waste and developed methods to extract value efficiently. Recycling wax wasn't just frugality, it was smart, practical, and essential. Every bit of leftover wax contributed to light, warmth, and even economic activity. It's a reminder that humans have long been clever recyclers, turning what seems useless into something indispensable. So next time you see old candles in your home, half-burned stubs, drips, or broken pieces, think about this. For centuries, these leftovers were material for new candles, sources of light, and even community resources. They weren't trash, they were functional, valuable, and carefully managed. Crazy, right? Something as small and seemingly insignificant as a candle stub could brighten a home, extend a celebration, or even support a local church or craft workshop. Today, we mostly ignore it. But history shows that even what we call waste can have practical, economic, and social value. Old candles are a melted-down reminder that creativity and resourcefulness can transform the ordinary into the extraordinary.
Horse manure. All right, get ready, because this next one might make you wrinkle your nose. But stick with me, because horse manure has a history way more interesting than it smells.
Yep, that stuff left behind by horses in stables, streets, or pastures. Today, most of us think of it as disgusting waste to be shoveled and tossed. But throughout history, horse manure was incredibly valuable, used as fertilizer, bedding, and even fuel. What we now consider trash was once a critical resource for agriculture, households, and energy. Let's start with the most obvious use: fertilizer. Before chemical fertilizers existed, farmers had to rely on natural sources to enrich the soil. Horse manure is packed with nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, that plants need to grow. Farmers would collect manure from stables or streets, let it compost, and spread it across fields to increase crop yields. Imagine entire villages carefully gathering horse manure after daily chores. It was literally the backbone of agricultural productivity. A pile of horse droppings wasn't trash. It was future food, growth, and survival. And it wasn't just fertilizer. Horse manure was also used as bedding material in stables. Mixed with straw, it helped absorb moisture, keep horses comfortable, and maintain clean stables. After a while, this mixture could be collected and reused as compost for fields, creating a closed-loop system that maximized every bit of waste. People recognized that manure had multiple uses and didn't just dispose of it, they turned it into practical, sustainable resources. Here's something you might not expect. In some regions, horse manure was even used as fuel. Dried manure burned surprisingly well and was used to heat homes, cook food, or fire kilns. In places where wood was scarce, dried horse droppings could literally keep families warm during the winter. What seems like gross waste today was once a critical energy source. People didn't see it as disgusting, they saw it as practical, multi-purpose material. Horse manure also played a role in urban life. In the 18th and 19th centuries, cities were filled with horses for transportation, hauling goods, and farming. Manure was collected, transported, and sold to farms outside the city, creating a valuable trade commodity. Stables and farmers alike profited from what we now think of as simple waste. A pile of manure on the street could be transformed into food for crops, warmth for homes, and income for families. Contrast that with today. Modern agriculture relies on chemical fertilizers, synthetic bedding, and fossil fuels. Horse manure is mostly a byproduct, often considered a nuisance rather than a treasure. The careful collection and creative reuse that sustained societies for centuries has mostly disappeared. A pile of horse manure that once fed crops, heated homes, and enriched soil is now scooped into compost heaps or discarded. Here's a mental picture. Imagine a bustling 19th century farm or stable. Workers are collecting manure, separating it from bedding, and preparing it for fields. Some is left to compost, some is dried for fuel, and some is packed and sold to neighboring villages. Every bit is valuable, and nothing is wasted. Compare that to today, where urban streets and modern farms treat it mostly as waste to manage. It's the same material, completely different perceived value. Horse manure is also a great example of human ingenuity and sustainability. People recognized potential in what others considered waste and developed multiple uses for it: fertilizer, bedding, and fuel. They didn't just discard it, they integrated it into agriculture, energy, and commerce. Every shovelful had multiple purposes, reflecting a mindset of maximizing resources and minimizing waste. So, next time you see horse manure, whether in a stable, farm, or even in historical accounts, think about this. For centuries, it was fertilizer, bedding,
and fuel, a multi-purpose material that people carefully collected and reused. It wasn't trash. It was a practical, valuable resource, essential for survival, agriculture, and energy. Crazy, right? Something as simple and seemingly gross as horse manure had immense practical, economic, and survival value. Today, we mostly ignore it, but history shows that even what we consider waste can have critical, versatile uses. Horse manure is a smelly, earthy reminder that human ingenuity turns the ordinary and the messy into indispensable.
Potato peelings are a perfect example of how human ingenuity can transform something we now throw in the trash into something useful. For centuries, potato peelings were not just waste. They were actually a raw material for alcohol production, animal feed, and even source of energy in some regions. The most straightforward use was fermentation into alcohol. Potato peelings have sugars and nutrients that yeast can feed on. People would collect the peelings, mash them, and ferment them to create spirits, vodkas, or local liquors. In rural communities, potato peelings could provide the base for homemade alcoholic beverages that were essential for social gatherings, celebrations, and even medicinal use. What we now toss in the bin was once a source of nutrition, culture, and economy. In some regions, potato peelings were also used for animal feed. While alcohol production might have been the primary use, in others, leftover peelings were fed to pigs or chickens. Nothing went to waste. Even the scraps from cooking contributed to the circular economy of the household, nourishing animals that would in turn provide meat, eggs, or manure. There's also an economic angle. Small-scale distilleries often purchased or traded in potato peelings to produce alcohol commercially. It was a low-cost, high-return raw material, transforming what households might have considered useless into a profitable product. Alcohol production has always been intertwined with human culture, trade, and celebration, and potato peelings played a surprisingly integral role in that economy. Mental picture a small rural kitchen in 19th century Ireland or Eastern Europe. Potatoes are peeled for dinner, and instead of tossing the skins, the cook collects them in a bucket. Later, the peelings are boiled, mashed, and left to ferment. After a few days, the result becomes local spirit, ready for the family's use, sale, or trade. Every tiny peel has potential, and nothing is wasted. Compare that to a modern kitchen, where the peelings are swept straight into the compost bin. The same material, entirely different perception of value. Potato peelings are also a perfect example of human ingenuity. People noticed potential in what others saw as waste and developed systems to extract value, whether for alcohol, animal feed, or compost. They didn't just discard leftovers, they turned scraps into sustenance, commerce, and social enrichment. Every peel contributed to survival, economy, and culture. So next time you peel potatoes, think about this. For centuries, those thin skins were raw material for alcohol, food for animals, and a part of a larger system of household efficiency. They weren't trash, they were resources, cleverly repurposed by communities who understood the value in every bit of food. Crazy, right? Something as simple and seemingly insignificant as potato peelings could be turned into alcohol, contribute to trade, or nourish animals. Today, we mostly ignore them. But history shows that even what we call waste can have practical, economic, and social value. Potato peelings are a perfect example of human ingenuity.
Candle stubs. All right, let's shine a light on something you probably overlook. Candle stubs made of tallow. Yep, those little leftover bits of old candles, short, misshapen, half-burned. Today, most of us just toss them into a drawer or bin, maybe forget about them entirely. But back in the day, candle stubs were extremely valuable because they could be reused for soap and lighting. What seems like trash today was once a critical part of daily life and household economy. Let's start with lighting. Before the invention of cheap paraffin or electric bulbs, people relied heavily on tallow candles to brighten homes, workshops, and streets. But wax and tallow were expensive, so households couldn't just throw away a stub that was too short to burn on its own. Instead, people would carefully collect and remelt candle stubs, forming new candles that were just as functional as the originals. Even the tiniest stub could be combined with others to make a candle that would last through the night. Every bit had practical value, and nothing was wasted. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Tallow stubs were also used to make soap. Tallow is rendered animal fat, and it's perfect for soap making. People would melt down leftover candle bits, combine them with lye or ashes, and produce bars of soap for cleaning, washing clothes, or personal hygiene. A little candle stub could be turned into cleaning supplies, essential for health and daily life. What we see as trash was actually a raw material for personal care and household maintenance. And let's talk about the economy. Candle stubs weren't just recycled at home. They were often collected and sold or traded. In villages and towns, people would bring stubs to local candle makers or soap producers who would remelt them and reshape them. This created a small but valuable economy around waste reuse, ensuring that nothing went to waste and everyone could benefit. Candle stubs became a commodity in themselves, bridging households, craftsmen, and local markets. Contrast that with today. Modern candles are cheap, synthetic, and widely available. Soap is mass-produced, and households rarely consider reusing candle stubs. Most old candles are tossed or forgotten, and the skills required to melt and reform tallow are mostly lost. The careful collection and creative reuse that once sustained entire communities has largely disappeared. A candle stub that could once provide light or soap is now treated as disposable, showing how much our perception of waste has changed. Here's a mental picture. Imagine a small 18th century kitchen. Candle stubs are collected in a jar, sorted by type, and carefully melted in a small pot. The wax is strained and poured into molds to create new candles. Some stubs are mixed with lye to make soap. Children help by trimming wicks, and the family watches as trash transforms into light and cleanliness. Every tiny piece has a purpose, and nothing is wasted. Compare that to a modern home, where leftover stubs might sit in a drawer for years or be tossed into the bin. The same material, entirely different value. Candle stubs are also a perfect example of human ingenuity and sustainability.
People noticed potential in what others considered useless and developed methods to extract value. Recycling tallow into candles or soap wasn't just frugality. It was practical, economic, and essential, ensuring light and cleanliness for households. Every stub mattered, and every bit contributed to survival and comfort. So, next time you see these candle stubs, these short leftover bits in your drawer, think about this. For centuries, they were raw material for light and soap, essential tools for everyday life. They weren't trash. They were functional, valuable, and carefully managed resources. Crazy, right? Something as small and seemingly insignificant as a candle stub could illuminate a home, provide hygiene, and even create economic opportunity. Today, we mostly ignore them, but history shows that even what we call waste can have practical, economic, and social value. Candle stubs made of tallow are a waxy reminder that human creativity often turns the ordinary or the discarded into something indispensable.
Fruit pits. All right, let's get into something that most of us just throw away without thinking. Fruit pits. Yep, those hard little cores from peaches, cherries, apricots, or olives that you usually spit out or toss in the trash. Today, they're considered completely useless, but in history, fruit pits were actually extremely valuable, turned into jewelry, ornaments, and even oil. What we see as waste today was once a material for art, craft, and practical use. Let's start with the creative side, jewelry and ornaments. People discovered that certain fruit pits, like peach or olive pits, could be carved, polished, or painted to make intricate pendants, beads, or miniature sculptures. Artisans would carefully select the smoothest, hardest pits and transform them into tiny works of art. In some cultures, pit jewelry was worn as personal adornment, used in religious ceremonies, or traded as decorative items. What seems like a tiny, worthless seed was actually a canvas for craftsmanship and creativity. And it wasn't just decorative. It could be functional, too. Fruit pits were sometimes turned into buttons, small tools, or game pieces. Their hard texture and durability made them perfect for tiny objects that needed to last. A single pit could be carved into a miniature chess piece, a dice, or even a small token for ceremonial use. People didn't just see pits as waste, they saw them as raw material for functional and beautiful objects. Here's another fascinating use: oil extraction. Certain pits like apricot or peach pits contain kernels that can be pressed for oil. This oil was prized for cooking, medicine, and even cosmetics. Communities learned to collect pits after eating or processing fruit, press them carefully, and extract valuable oil. What seems like the hardest, most useless part of the fruit can actually produce something edible, healing, or aromatic. A real hidden treasure inside waste. Fruit pits were also used in trade and economy. Carved pits, oil, or other derived products could be sold or exchanged in local markets. An artisan who could turn pits into jewelry or ornaments had a steady stream of material that others would pay for, creating a small but valuable economy around something most people discard. Even leftover fruit pits became part of commerce and craftsmanship, proving that value can be found in the most overlooked places. Contrast that to today. Most fruit pits are simply discarded or composted. Very few people think about carving them into beads, making miniature ornaments, or pressing them for oil. Modern synthetic materials, cheap jewelry, and industrial oils have replaced many of these historical uses. A fruit pit that once held multiple potential uses is now mostly seen as garbage, showing how cultural and technological change can shift the perception of value. Here's a mental picture. Imagine a 19th century artisan workshop. A pile of cherry and peach pits sits on a table. The artisan picks the best ones, carving them into beads for necklaces, polishing them for pendants, or preparing kernels for oil extraction. Every pit has potential and nothing is wasted. Compare that to a modern kitchen, where pits are swept into the compost or trash. The same material, completely different perception of worth. Fruit pits are also a perfect example of human ingenuity. People noticed potential in what others considered useless and found ways to integrate them into daily life, art, and economy. They didn't just discard pits, they transformed them into objects of beauty, functional tools, and valuable oil, making the most of every part of the fruit. Every discarded pit had potential to become something extraordinary. So next time you eat a peach, cherry, or apricot, think about this. The hard pit you spit out or toss in the trash could have been jewelry, an ornament, a functional tool, or even oil. It wasn't trash. It was raw material, craftsmanship, and potential energy waiting to be realized. Crazy, right? Something as tiny and seemingly insignificant as a fruit pit could decorate a necklace, serve as a tool, or produce oil for cooking and medicine. Today we mostly ignore them, but history shows that even what we call waste can have practical, aesthetic, and economic value. Fruit pits are a hard little reminder that human creativity often turns the ordinary, or the discarded, into something extraordinary.
Coral fragments. All right, let's dive into something that might make you think twice the next time you see a piece of coral on the beach. Coral fragments. Yep, those broken bits of coral that wash up along the shore or get chipped off reefs. Today, most people leave them alone or discard them because of reef protection laws and environmental awareness. But historically, coral fragments were incredibly valuable, used in ancient jewelry, ornaments, and even talismans. What we now see as fragile debris was once a treasured material for adornment and status. Let's start with jewelry. In ancient civilizations, especially around the Mediterranean, coral was highly prized for necklaces, earrings, bracelets, and ceremonial adornments. Even tiny fragments could be polished, shaped, and strung into beautiful patterns. Red coral, in particular, was seen as a symbol of wealth, protection, and vitality, and fragments were carefully collected to create luxurious items. What we might now consider insignificant or broken had immense aesthetic and cultural value. Coral fragments were also used in ornamental art and decoration. They could be inlaid into boxes, furniture, or religious artifacts, adding color and texture. Artisans developed techniques to shape fragments into intricate patterns, turning what seemed like random, broken bits into objects of beauty and prestige. Every small piece of coral could contribute to personal or communal artistry, making the most of nature's bounty. And here's a fascinating one. In some cultures, coral fragments were believed to have protective or magical properties. They were used in amulets, charms, and ritual objects. People thought coral could ward off evil, bring good luck, or even heal ailments. Even fragments that had broken off naturally were considered powerful and valuable, not worthless. Something as fragile and discarded as a coral shard held symbolic and spiritual significance. Coral fragments also had an economic role. They were collected, polished, and sold in local markets or traded across regions. In societies where coral jewelry was a sign of status, a small fragment could be transformed into a tradable commodity, linking artisans, merchants, and households. What might seem like tiny broken bits could actually generate income or social prestige, a perfect example of turning waste into value. Contrast that with today. Modern jewelry and decoration largely rely on synthetic materials or sustainably sourced alternatives. Due to reef protection and environmental laws, removing coral fragments is discouraged or illegal. What was once a common material for adornment and trade is now carefully preserved in its natural habitat. Tiny coral pieces that could have been polished into jewelry in the past are now protected resources, highlighting a shift in both perception and ethics. Here's a mental picture. Imagine a bustling ancient marketplace along the Mediterranean coast. Artisans carefully pick up broken coral fragments washed ashore or collected from the sea. They polish the pieces, drill tiny holes, and string them into necklaces or inlay them into decorative items. Even the smallest fragment has a purpose, and nothing is wasted. Compare that to today, where collecting coral is illegal or discouraged. The same material, completely different social and legal value. Coral fragments are also a testament to human creativity and resourcefulness. People noticed beauty, durability, and symbolic power in what others might discard. They transformed fragile, broken fragments into jewelry, art, and talismans, making the most of nature's bounty. Every shard had the potential to become something extraordinary, combining aesthetics, utility, and social significance. So next time you see a piece of coral on the beach or even in a historical artifact, think about this. For centuries, coral fragments were raw material for jewelry, decoration, and ritual objects. They weren't trash, they were prized, cherished, and carefully utilized, contributing to fashion, art, and culture. Crazy, right? Something as small and seemingly insignificant as a coral fragment could decorate a necklace, enhance an altar, or serve as a protective charm. Today, we mostly leave them alone, but history shows that even what we call waste can have practical, aesthetic, and economic value. Coral fragments are a testament to human ingenuity and resourcefulness. People noticed beauty, durability, and symbolic power in what others might discard. They transformed fragile, broken fragments into jewelry, art, and talismans, making the most of natural resources.
Broken pottery shards. All right, let's talk about something that might be lying forgotten in your backyard, your garage, or even an archaeological site. Broken pottery shards. Yep, those fragments of plates, bowls or jars that have seen better days. Today, we mostly think of them as trash or archaeological curiosities. But for centuries, broken pottery shards were actually valuable, used as fillers in building and road construction. What seems like discarded fragments were once practical, essential materials for everyday infrastructure. Let's start with the construction side. In ancient and medieval times, pottery was everywhere, used for cooking, storage, and transport. Inevitably, pieces would break, but instead of discarding these shards, builders realized they could mix them into mud, clay, or mortar to strengthen walls and floors. Shards added texture, stability, and durability, acting as a kind of early recycled reinforcement. What we now think of as waste became a key ingredient for making buildings last longer. And it wasn't just for small-scale construction. Broken pottery shards were also used in road building. Ancient roads often required a stable, well-draining base. Layers of crushed pottery, stones, and other materials helped create surfaces that could withstand traffic and weather. In a time before asphalt or modern concrete, shards were functional, durable, and essential for infrastructure. A pile of broken pottery in one household could end up literally supporting the streets of a town. Here's another clever use. Pottery shards were sometimes ground into powder and added to plaster or lime. This improved the mixture's hardness and water resistance. Builders and craftsmen understood that nothing was truly waste. They saw every fragment as a resource that could enhance strength, stability, and functionality. Even broken pieces had a new purpose, extending their usefulness far beyond the kitchen or storage jar they once belonged to. Broken pottery shards also had an economic angle. In many communities, shards were collected, traded, or sold to builders and craftsmen. People realized that discarded pottery could be transformed into practical, profitable materials for construction. Instead of just throwing fragments away, households contributed to the local economy and infrastructure, turning trash into something that supported the entire community. Contrast that to today. Modern building materials like concrete, asphalt, and steel have largely replaced the need for pottery shards. Most broken ceramics are simply discarded, recycled in specialized processes, or end up in landfills. A fragment that once strengthened a wall or a road is now treated as waste, showing how technology and changing materials have shifted our perception of value. Here's that mental picture. Imagine an ancient town bustling with activity. Broken pots and jars are collected from homes, kilns, and markets. Builders crush them, mix them into mortar, and spread them into walls or roadbeds. Every shard contributes to a stronger building, a smoother street, or a more durable infrastructure. Nothing is wasted. Every fragment has practical purpose and social value. Compare that to a modern city, where broken pottery is mostly ignored or recycled industrially. The same material, completely different significance. Broken pottery shards are also perfect examples of human ingenuity and resourcefulness. People noticed potential in what others considered useless and found ways to integrate these fragments into vital structures. They didn't discard them. They reinforced homes, streets, and public spaces, maximizing every bit of available material. Every shard mattered, contributing to the safety, durability, and functionality of daily life. So next time you see a broken plate or a shard lying around, think about this. For centuries, these fragments were raw material for building, road construction, and plaster. They weren't trash. They were practical, valuable, and carefully utilized resources. Crazy, right? Something as small and seemingly insignificant as a broken piece of pottery could strengthen a wall, support a road, or enhance plaster. Today, we mostly ignore them, but history shows that even what we call waste can have practical, economic, and structural value. Broken pottery shards are a hard reminder that human creativity often turns the ordinary or the discarded into something indispensable.
Discarded shells. All right, let's get into something that might be lying on a beach or washed up in a kitchen. Discarded shells. Yep, those empty shells from clams, oysters, or other mollusks that most of us just throw away after eating. Today, they're usually tossed aside or composted, but for centuries, discarded shells were incredibly valuable, especially for their mother of pearl, which was used in inlays for furniture, art, and decoration. What seems like ordinary trash today was once a prized material for luxury, beauty, and craftsmanship. Let's start with the decorative side. Mother of pearl is that shimmering, iridescent layer inside certain shells, and artisans discovered that it could be cut, polished, and inlaid into wood, metal, and other materials. Cabinets, musical instruments, boxes, and even jewelry were enhanced with these lustrous pieces. Tiny discarded shells that no longer had meat inside could be transformed into glimmering, luxurious decorations, making something ordinary into something extraordinary. And it wasn't just about beauty, it was about skill and economy. Artisans learned to carefully select shells, saw them into shapes, and polish them to reveal that inner shine. Even broken or small pieces were valuable because every fragment could contribute to a larger mosaic or design. What we now consider trash was actually raw material for art, craftsmanship, and status symbols. Here's a cool one. Mother-of-pearl inlays were also used in musical instruments. Harps, lutes, flutes, and other instruments often had shimmering designs made from discarded shells. Musicians and instrument makers valued these inlays not just for aesthetics, but because they signified quality and prestige. A tiny piece of shell from the kitchen could end up enhancing an instrument's beauty and value, showing how something mundane could be elevated through craft. Discarded shells were also used in jewelry and personal accessories. Buttons, brooches, combs, and even small pendants could be crafted from polished shell pieces. In some cultures, mother of pearl was a sign of wealth, sophistication, or spiritual significance. Artisans saw potential in even the smallest fragments, turning what we see as waste into precious adornments. Economically, shells were a tradable resource. Markets and workshops often collected discarded shells, paying little or nothing for them, and then transformed them into inlay materials for furniture, art, and instruments. Households could sell shells instead of throwing them away, contributing to a small but important recycling economy. What seemed like trash in one home could become luxury material in another, linking daily life, craft, and commerce. Contrast that with today. Modern furniture and decorative objects mostly use synthetic materials, plastics, or cultured mother of pearl. Many discarded shells are simply composted, washed into the ocean, or left on beaches. A shell that once held value for artisans and musicians is now mostly ignored, showing how technological and cultural changes affect what we consider valuable. Here's a mental picture. Imagine a 19th century artisan workshop. A pile of discarded oyster and clam shells sits on a table. The artisan selects the best pieces, carefully cutting and polishing them. Tiny fragments are inlaid into wooden boxes, musical instruments, and fine furniture.
Every shell, no matter how small or broken, contributes to the creation of beauty and prestige. Compare that to a modern home, where shells are washed into the sink or composted. The same material, completely different perception of worth. Discarded shells are also a perfect example of human ingenuity and resourcefulness. People noticed potential in what others considered waste and found ways to integrate shells into art, craft, and economy. They didn't just discard them. They transformed leftovers from meals into shimmering works of beauty, maximizing every bit of natural material. So next time you see a discarded shell, think about this. For centuries, shells were raw material for mother-of-pearl inlays, musical instruments, and jewelry. They weren't trash. They were prized, functional, and carefully utilized resources that enhanced everyday life. Crazy, right? Something as small and seemingly insignificant as a discarded shell could become a gleaming piece of art, a decorative button, or an inlay in a musical instrument. Today, we mostly ignore them, but history shows that even what we call waste can have practical, aesthetic, and economic value. Discarded shells are a pearly reminder that human creativity often turns the ordinary, or the discarded, into something extraordinary.
Cinders from burned wood. All right, let's dive into something that might seem completely useless at first glance. Cinders from burned wood. Yep, those blackened bits left behind after a fire dies down, whether in a fireplace, stove, or outdoor fire pit. Today, most of us just sweep them up and toss them in the trash or compost. But for centuries, cinders were actually valuable, used as fertilizer, soil amendment, and even insulation. What seems like simple waste today was once a critical, multi-purpose material for homes, farms, and gardens. Let's start with agriculture. Cinders, or wood ash, are packed with minerals like potassium, calcium, and trace elements that plants need to thrive. Before chemical fertilizers, people collected cinders after cooking or heating and spread them over fields, gardens, or orchards. The ash enriched soil, adjusted pH levels, and helped crops grow stronger and healthier. A pile of blackened fire residue that most of us would throw away was actually a nutrient-rich boost for food production. But it wasn't just about fertilizer. Cinders were also used as insulation. In some regions, households would layer cinders in floors, walls, or around hearths to retain heat. The lightweight, porous material could trap warmth and prevent moisture, keeping homes warmer during cold months. What seems like leftover ash or burnt wood was actually a natural, effective insulating material that helped families survive harsh winters. Here's another clever use. Cinders were often mixed into mud or clay for building purposes. They could reduce cracking, improve drying times, and strengthen bricks or adobe walls. In regions where construction materials were scarce, burned wood residue became an essential additive, enhancing the durability and functionality of buildings. What we now think of as trash was a practical tool for long-lasting construction. Cinders were also economically valuable. In some communities, ashes were collected, packaged, and sold as fertilizer or soil conditioner. Farmers who didn't have access to wood for burning could purchase cinders to improve their fields. This created a small but important economy, turning household fire residue into a tradable, useful commodity. A pile of cinders could literally become money in the right hands. Contrast that with today. Modern agriculture relies on synthetic fertilizers. Insulation is made from plastics or fibers, and construction materials have advanced dramatically. Most wood cinders are now composted, used in small-scale gardening, or discarded.
the careful collection and creative reuse that sustained communities for centuries has mostly disappeared. What was once a multi-purpose resource is now mostly ignored. Here's a mental picture. Imagine a 19th century rural household. After cooking and heating, cinders are carefully swept from the hearth and stored in barrels. Some go into fields to nourish crops, some are mixed into clay for building, and some are used to insulate floors and walls. Every bit has purpose, and nothing is wasted. Compare that to a modern home, where ashes are swept out and discarded. The same material, completely different perception of value. Cinders from burned wood are also a perfect example of human ingenuity and sustainability. People noticed potential in what others considered waste and developed multiple uses for it: fertilizer, insulation, and building material. They didn't just discard ashes, they integrated them into daily life, maximizing resources and minimizing waste. Every pile of cinders mattered, contributing to food production, warmth, and structural integrity. So next time you see cinders from a fire, think about this. For centuries, burned wood residues were fertilizer, building material, and insulation. They weren't trash. They were practical, valuable, and carefully utilized resources. Crazy, right? Something as small and seemingly insignificant as wood cinders could nourish crops, strengthen buildings, and keep homes warm. Today, we mostly ignore them, but history shows that even what we call waste can have practical, economic, and structural value. Cinders from burned wood are a smoky reminder that human creativity often turns the ordinary or the discarded into something indispensable.